a very warm welcome to those of you who made it despite the warm weather outside to come to attend our panel, our design talks on Made by Women. So most of you in the space already know the exhibition and are related to it, but maybe to the two guests who might not know something about Retrotopia so far. So it has been a huge collaboration project with 11 partners from countries, from 11 different countries or 10 different countries, including then the 11th, the former GDR. And it's the first project who brings together so many different positions on socialist design in the former Eastern Bloc and ex-Yugoslavia. I'm very happy to welcome also some of the co-curators, and I'm especially grateful to you, Alyona, because you came up with the idea to have this very important panel on a utopian topic within the big utopian vision, namely the equality of women, also within the field of architecture and design. And yeah, you started to organize this panel together with Helena Huber-Doudová, who is also one of the co-curators and expert also in architecture. And I'm also very warm welcome the other speakers, and I will introduce you later. And I would say we directly start since we have a tough program. And so please, Alyona, I ask you to come to the stage, and this is not.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Claudia, and I want to deeply thank Kunstgewerbemuseum for providing me with this opportunity to present my research outcomes, to my colleagues and researchers for supporting this project, and to all of you for your interest in the subject. And I officially started this research project together with my mother in 2016 after our family moved to Germany and during my maternity leave. But as a curator, I worked on several projects on the Soviet design history since 2012, and that allowed me to meet and discover projects and works by many amazing women whose names I am not included in any of design history books. So the aim of the research is to determine the extent of Soviet women's contribution to design and to identify specific problems faced by Soviet women designers that made their contribution less visible. And despite the worldwide recognition of the so-called Amazons of the Soviet avant-garde, further achievement of the Soviet women in the field of art and design are relatively poorly covered in most professional and popular science literature, and it's only recently that the situation began to change. For example, there was a personal biography of Galina Balashova published by Philip Moise, and works by Anna Andreeva, both by New York MoMA. And at this stage of research, I have compiled a database that includes more than 4,000 women designers so far who contributed to major Soviet design projects and conducted over 20 interviews. I was also very much motivated by the book Invisible Woman by Caroline Criado-Perez, because on multiple examples she managed to demonstrate the importance of gender-specific data collection, and as well as the crucial role of women's involvement into decision-making, considering all levels of our material environment, from urban planning and architecture to design of everyday products, industrial equipment, medicine, and so on. So today I will first highlight a couple of issues that made history of Soviet women designers invisible to the general audience, as well as showcase the importance of their contribution. The young Soviet state progressively proclaimed the legal equality of its citizens already in its first constitution in 1918. And during the 1920s, it provided new professional opportunities for many world-renowned avant-garde artists and designers. And I have a separate research on the role of women at the first Soviet School of Architecture, Art and Design of Hutomaz, and I'm now finishing paper on growing role of women in art and design education of the pre-revolution Russian Empire for the Pioneers of Design Education project. But however, during the 30s and 50s, as the Soviet state policy shifted toward the totalitarian regime of Joseph Stalin, all creative activities became limited to professional unions, traditionally dominated by men. And furthermore, after the end of the World War II, state propaganda began to emphasize the reproductive role of women, and therefore major changes were made to the family legislation. The feminist kitchen debate that took place in 1959 between the US Vice President Richard Nixon and the Soviet Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev demonstrated the general unsettledness of Soviet life, where liberation of women from kitchen slavery never happened, and the commune houses and kitchen factories of the 1920s remained utopias. And although the 1968 family law stipulated that Soviet women shall be provided with the necessary social and domestic conditions to combine a happy motherhood with increasingly active and creative participation in production and the social political life, in reality it merely confirmed that motherhood and women's family obligations were once again brought to the fore. And my research on the gender of the late Soviet things showcased how design and advertisement of the late Soviet goods emphasized the traditionally stereotype of femininity as opposed to the gender-neutral concepts of the early 20s. And the need to combine a greater number of social roles was certainly one of the factors which hampered women's careers development in the USSR. And despite the promoted equality, fine arts and architecture remained male-dominant professions in the USSR. However, Soviet vision of design as an artistic engineering was originally closer to the sphere of technical service rather than to fine arts, providing women with new career opportunities. For example, industrial designer Svetlana Mirzayan, who was responsible for a huge range of industrial and graphic design projects, told me that she originally wanted to study sculpture, but her place at the LHPU Muchinai was given to a male student, while she was suggested to go to the less popular metalworks department. And Tatiana Samoilova intentionally entered the same metalworks department because of the lower competition there, to realize her creative skills later on. Several women that I've interviewed complained that they dreamed of working as a theater stage designers, but this type of job was almost impossible to get for a woman in the USSR, and my research proves that. An image of a technically skilled woman actively involved in hand labor or scientific research work was highly promoted as a symbol of gender equality of the Soviet citizen, so it was easier for women to enter the world of natural science and engineering rather than fine art. And many of the women that I interviewed had a technical education. For example, Marina Mikheeva, a valuable member of Dmitry's Azarkan team at the VNIT. And one of the most striking cases is, of course, the history of Galina Balashova, a Soviet architect, engineer, and artist who designed the interiors of orbital models for all major Soviet spacecraft and space station between 1963 and 1986. She was the first Soviet space architect and interior designer to come up with many original solutions for zero-gravity environment. For example, Balashova designed an earthly color scheme with a darker floor for improved spatial orientation, and she invented the Welke fastening system so that astronauts could easily attach small objects or even fix themselves to various surfaces. And despite her pioneering work, that was typical of her time, was that this woman was tasked with providing a domestically comfortable interior, and the results was the cured corners of the two main functional sections of the first space model, which Galina Balashova renamed as cupboard and sofa. She referred to them this way, and the original use of textiles, even a painting hanging on the walls of the space capsule. But it should be noted that all of her design projects were carried out informally, anonymously, and without any payment, as she was only employed as an equipment layout engineer. As she mentioned to me in an interview, I only signed official engineering project. I was not authorized to sign any other documents. My seniors published my work in their scientific articles without even mentioning my name, as they didn't want some woman to get a credit for it. I was only accepted to the Union of Architects after I had officially retired. And I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Philip Moise, who has rediscovered and promoted my work internationally. So a closer look at the array of industrial and furniture design projects by Soviet women debunks popular stereotypes about male and female design. When women were given an opportunity to contribute to an activity or a project, they were no less inventive and successful than men. Ironically, Svetlana Silvestrova, a chief editor of the journal Technical Aesthetics, wrote there in 1983, "Women designers work equally successfully in all spheres. However, we do not have many female head of design services. Apparently, certain qualities of characters are involved." Although my research shows that the problem is deeply rooted in social hierarchies and stereotypes. So we should also look at different strategies of adaptation of female designers to a male working environment. And I use different case studies to consider women within creative teams brought together by a strong and charismatic male leader, women working in creative partnership with men, women organizing into separate women's groups or working independently. That was often the most complicated career scenario for them. One of the downsides of the collective style of project work developed in the USSR is a difficulty in identifying a real author of the project. Quite often there were male directors or even chief accountants of the factories who insisted on being included into the industrial patent in order to share the money for it. In addition, I've already identified several cases of appropriation of women's work by their male colleagues. And due to a combination of political and economic reasons, less than 1/3 of all design projects created in the USSR ever made it to production. So many works like those that you see on the screens were created by designers for the future and went straight into the desk, which was another reason why a significant number of women's designers' work remained unknown. And unfortunately, most of the state and private archives that I work with on this subject provide rather fragmented information. I also conducted a statistical analysis based on publications in the Technical Aesthetics, that was a word for design theory in USSR, USSR's Decorative Arts and USSR's Architecture Journal. On these diagrams, you can clearly see that although from the 1960s to the breakup of the Soviet Union, the number of women employed in all kinds of design-related professions was steadily increasing, the number of women mentioned in the context of decorative arts is much bigger than in industrial design and architecture, and that the number of women writing about art and design is much bigger than the number of women whose art and design projects were selected for the publication. The information that is currently available suggests that a significant gender gap had persisted through the years on all levels across the different design professions available to Soviet women. The next set of tables that I'm currently working on provides an opportunity for the in-depth study of professional profile of each woman mentioned in these magazines. I'm also doing a separate study on the regional aspect that is very important from the colonial perspective. Although these magazines were supposed to stand for the whole USSR, as you can guess from the titles, the in-depth study of the content proves how much Russian-centered they were, including the fact that they were only published in Russian language. And the central institution of the Soviet state design system, the All-Union Research Institute of Technical Aesthetics, VNIT, was established in Moscow in 1962. And mirroring the government top-down hierarchical approach to management, the VNIT's head office sucked resources from all its regional branches, while preventing them from directly collaborating with each other, as you see in this quote by Dmitry Azrikan. And it also controlled an extensive network of special art and design bureaus, SHKBs, and all other design organizations across the Soviet Union. Planet economy and the realities of the centralized system of resource allocation that implemented building production chains that were pretty complex in terms of geography and logistics, and sometimes even counterproductive. In any discussion on design, all these complex economic structures and geographies should be also taken into the account. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union due to the traumatic memories of the Soviet past, a large part of the Soviet design legacy was obliterated from both in the former Soviet republics and in Russia itself, and it's only recently that the situation has begun to change. And remarkably, while creating an independent design history has been seen as a priority by any former Soviet republic, it would be impossible to put things into perspective without considering this pan-Soviet context and developing a new language for discussion instead of ignoring these problematic issues. And to reverse this overall Russocentrist trend within the Soviet design history, it is essential that we understand the whole range of factors that caused local design histories of the former Soviet republics to become less visible to the international community. As you can see here, most of the project published in the whole magazine that was supposed to stand for the whole design system was centered around Moscow, with the regional projects going sometimes up to zero. And each of the VNIT's regional branches had its own specialization depending on local industry and traditions, and the study of women professional roles in these branches of VNIT should contribute to the cultural and gender diversity in the representation of the historical heritage of the Soviet design. At the same time, it would contribute to the deeper understanding of how women from the regional branches were excluded from the global discourses, both as representative of a particular region and as women. One can question himself or herself, maybe it's a reasonable statistic and there were only a few women designers, for example, in Soviet Georgia. But my current case study on the archives of the Georgian branch of the VNIT reveals quite an opposite picture. As you can see, from all the women that I managed to trace in the department, like over 180, only 5 women were mentioned in the whole journal through the study period, and among them only 1 was published with portrait. While from some other regions, such as the Far East, none were published, and the only regional branch of the VNIT headed by women were in Lithuania. Maya Paželaitė, a talented industrial designer, art and design historian. And it is another interesting observation that of all the regional branches, the highest number of published portraits of women designers was also from the Vilnius branch. While, for example, from Armenia there were only 2. And however, I believe that this personification is important, otherwise the whole magazine looks like a male club providing an accurate representation of the actual gender profile of the profession. So another issue to consider here is regional hierarchy within the Soviet Union. While officially all the republics were recognized as equal, in fact each of them had its own history of Sovietization and oppression. All these hierarchies had a direct influence on career paths of many designers who eventually moved from the republics to the center, often even ended up in a foreign country, and eventually went down in history as either Moscow or foreign designers. But if we study selected biographies of Soviet designers, we will be able to visualize these processes of cultural transfer and see how the Russian SFSR managed its region's intellectual resources. For instance, Svetlana Mirzayan, who I already mentioned before, originated from Armenian family, living in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, where she got her design education. And after that, she was proposed to join SHKB in Latvia, where she created many high-quality projects and also learned from several famous Latvian designers before returning to Leningrad. So this is yet another example illustrating how important it is to consider the whole structure of the Soviet design system rather than labeling designers by only one region. And now I will focus on several examples of how women designers were bringing their agency into the design profession and what kind of opportunities it provided to them. One of the most obvious yet an important thing is that women designers had a chance to improve products designed for women, of course, or even introduce completely new types of them. For example, as part of the Kulbit-Mash project, Tatiana Samoilova was responsible for developing a series of electric shavers together with Igor Cheprun. A study of the existing range showed that there was only one model for women among 30 types of shavers on the market. Tatiana Samoilova not only improved the design of the women's razor, but also developed a multifunctional manicure and massage cosmetic set compatible with it. She also observed that wearing a watch at home was not always convenient, especially for women engaging in a variety of household chores. Therefore, as part of the Vnitė Watches and Clocks 19 project, she proposed a portable time clip that could be programmed on a base station and attached to any type of clothing or other things. And the vibration of the clip could remind family member of time-sensitive tasks, increasing their productivity. For example, it could help a child to get home on time. On the slide, you can see a reconstructed model of this project that I did for the Retrotopia.Design traveling exhibition on women in design. And indeed, many women were particularly interested in designing for children and teenagers due to their traditional family responsibilities. For instance, this practical and transformable kindergarten furniture set, designed by a couple of Georgian designers, won a silver medal on the All-Union competition in 1967. However, Vnitė designer Irina Presnetsova explained to me that on top of that, the topic of designing for children and teenagers gave her the opportunity to experiment with creative concept, colors and shapes, avoiding many of the limitations of serious functionalist design for adults. As a diploma project, she designed modular equipment for children's theater, and at the Vnitė she worked together with Alexei Hauke on experimental design of the youth residential environment. And one of her proposals included a giant hat or jacket attached to a landline in a common hallway, and this allowed for some privacy while talking. Also, it is important to look at the huge number of women whose names are normally not mentioned in the list of contributors to the design project, but who nevertheless invested their knowledge and skills into its creation. A number of women who played an important role in the history of Soviet design had degrees in medicine, psychology, anthropology, biology, physics, and chemistry. In particular, women constituted a significant proportion of the staff of the Department of Decorative Materials and Finishing in Moscow and in other regional branches of the Vnitė. And at the Department of Ergonomics in Moscow, it was headed by Lyudmila Chaynova, who was also participated in the psychological training of the first Soviet cosmonauts, becoming a founding member of the cosmic psychology. Anna Chapovskaya, an ergonomist in the Belarusian branch of Vnitė, switched to design from a medical career because her ambition was not to just treat people who were ill, but to prevent occupational diseases. She studied and improved working and rest facilities at factories, as well as the employment criteria for the energy sector. Her first project focused on exploring the most common health complaints reported by female microelectronics industry workers aged between 18 and 25, including high blood pressure, decreased visual activity, fatigue and leg heaviness at the end of the work shift. She subsequently proposed a number of changes to the workplace environment that soon resulted in improving occupational health. Ergonomic laboratory of the Kiev branch of the Vnitė was also headed by a very talented woman, and psychologist from the ergonomic laboratory is also the only woman from the Azerbaijan branch of the Vnitė, whose portrait was featured in the Technical Aesthetics journal. In accordance with the state policy, the priority for ergonomic research was left to the military sector, industrial equipment, and agricultural machinery, but not for consumer products. Design for disabled in the Soviet Union also remained on the margins of the research interest of major design organizations and was conducted only within a few medical institutions. Exceptions were made only at the initiative of individual enthusiasts, such as Tatiana Suslova, designer at the Vnitė. Her PhD thesis became the basis for the International Seminar into Design 77 in Kharkiv, Ukraine, dedicated to the topic of design for elderly and disabled people. It even took her several years to establish a professional collaboration with ergonomist Lyubov Chaynova and anthropologist Lyudmila Kancha to create the USSR first and only design for a kitchen for disabled and elderly people, Dasha. Its second version received a gold medal at the exhibition of SMEA member countries designed for socialist society, but unfortunately was never put into the mass production. In her interview to me, Tatiana Suslova noted that the focus of her research arose out of a deep respect for her mother and grandmother who raised her together, and to whom she wished to care for in return. Soviet DIY culture existed in between people's amateur initiative grounded in necessity and practicality and the state propaganda of socialist ideology. Therefore, Soviet women designers could be studied from various perspectives. First, as subjects who experience a gender-related dimension of DIY household practices embodied in special sections of magazines and books addressed to women, as well as in labor education, уроки труда, that was introduced in the Soviet schools separately. Wood and metal works were for male students, while housekeeping and sewing for female, and that directly correlates with a bigger number of women involved in the fashion and textile design industry compared to woodwork and furniture design. At the same time, many women industrial designers that I talked to told me that they learned how to work with metal and wood at the early age, non-officially from their fathers and older brothers. Second, women should be viewed as agents who actively implemented DIY approach into their professional activities. However, an even more important aspect of the socialist DIY culture that could be found in many projects introduced by Soviet women was the high value of handicraft skills together with resourceful approach to the use of available materials. Examples include the alternative use of found object or leftovers from the industry, the repurposing of industrial technologies, the implementation of craft techniques, etc. For instance, Svetlana Mirzayan came up with this creative technological solution while working at the SHKB in Riga, and she used a spherical press form borrowed from a Latvian factory that produced teapots to make these spherical reflectors of industrial wall lamp in 1969. And it is interesting that at our exposition at the Retrotopia, you can see that Theodoras Kazimieras Valaitis created a wall decoration for a restaurant in Vilnius made from the metal cases of the Saturnus vacuum cleaners at the same year. So it was kind of a general trend. And Svetlana also used some found materials for these table lamps prototypes. This is another example of creative collaboration from designers couple working at the Far East branch of the VNIT. And finally, my favorite section, the last one. According to the Soviet designer and design historian Alexander Lavrentiev, unlike official fine art, Soviet design was on the periphery of the artistic culture, outside of close ideological control, and this allowed designers to make truly artistic experiments. The existence of this art design practice within the official Soviet state system of design during the 60s and 80s was not only a breath of a fresh air for designers in general, but also allowed many women to find their way into fine art. Anna Andreeva was a Soviet textile designer artist who also originally wanted to be an architect. From the 1940s to 1980s, she worked at the leading artist and experimental workshop at the Krasnaya Rosa, Red Rose silk factory in Moscow. It was there that she designed some of the textile prints for mass productions that have since become iconic for the Soviet textile industry. And due to the nature of her field of professional expertise, textile design, Andreeva enjoyed a certain level of creative freedom, something that the Soviet Union fine artists clearly did not have. And her designs were inspired by experiments with geometric shapes of the representatives of the Soviet avant-garde, as well as by folk culture, contemporary advances in science, and also by international kinetic and optical art. Her vibrant geometric patterns were selected to represent the Soviet textile industry at several international exhibitions, and you can see an example of it in the archive section of the exhibition. And her designs were used to make silk scarves that were given to as diplomatic gifts. And although some of her works also became a subject of censorship and were not approved for the production. And when a creative commission criticized some of her work for formalism, for abstraction, she was known for attaching a set of dried flowers on top of her drawings to pass the commission, or citing Lenin quotes about electrification for the same purpose. Also, the three-dimensional cubes design she officially did for children to pass the censorship. She later on produced for adults with a different color scheme. And it is surprising how, due to the power of her talent and a strong personality, Andreeva, as a woman with non-proletarian background, who refused to join the Communist Party and was married to an oppressed scientist who even went to Gulag, managed to hold several key positions at the Union of Artists of the USSR, and was also responsible for establishing up textile and silk production network across the Eastern Bloc. Her daughter, Tatyana Andreeva, has continued the family tradition as textile artist. In 1974, as part of her diploma, she came up with a total design project. Also, a part of it you can see at the archive section. A complementary system of graphic prints with optical patterns for various kinds of interior textiles, linoleum and wallpaper for 4 standard rooms of the Central House of Tourist Hotel that was supposed to build for the 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Moscow. Aiming to impress the foreign guests with bold and modern solutions, Tatyana Andreeva even proposed replacing the hotel guest umbrellas with plastic raincoats with bright contrasting prints, matching those designed for the interiors of each room. And a person wearing such a raincoat would blend in with the surrounding interior. This become a walking element of the interior design concept or part of this Kunstgewerbemuseum. Sadly enough, the proposal was approved but never implemented. Irina Presnitsova's sketches of psychological and soulful furniture were not designed for industrial production, but rather could be seen as a proposal for an art installation, reframing our knowledge about the relationship between people and the living environment. She believed that it's important to make a design that interacts not only with people's bodies, but with their souls. Therefore, she identified several possible design strategies for the installment of things. For example, implanting fragments of historical items, conveying memories or atmosphere of the past into new objects, or creating a kind of collage combining pieces of furniture with family, hall rooms, or other small items dear to the heart of the owners. Nadezhda Averyanova stayed at her driving desk after work to create artistic furniture proposals. An idea of the low table flag was her premonition of the forthcoming collapse of the Soviet Union. She had a night dream of the Soviet red flag melting into the puddle of blood on a stone block pavement of the Red Square in Moscow. The flag tabletop was supposed to be made from transparent red glass. It stands on 3 pioneer horns, and the fact that they are not fixed to the tabletop increased the fragile and unstable feeling of the whole construction. And the author claims that she was scared herself after she drew it, and that she had to make it look more natural while applying for the international competition in Paris, organized by the Society of Decorative Arts in 1990. And although a table model was criticized and intentionally destroyed by the head of her department at the Institute of Furniture, organizers from the French side included the image of the table into the catalogue and decorated the whole Soviet section of the exhibition with red flags in solidarity with her. And there she is, the only time she was able to come to Paris within this project. And finally, although it was almost impossible for a Soviet historian of art to write about contemporary Western art, many women art historians at the Vronskaya were the first to introduce Soviet readers to some of the biggest names in contemporary German, Italian, Japanese and American design. For instance, Galina Kurayeva even learned herself Italian in order to write about the most progressive and radical Italian design. Due to the lower level of censorship in design history, most of the women at art historians working at the Vronskaya contributed significantly to the rediscovery of the early Soviet avant-garde art and design for both Soviet and international readers, like Laisa Zhadova definitely did. And women art historians also contributed to a deeper study of the role of women in the history of Soviet art and design. And although the current presentation elates only some of the obscure histories of women's role in shaping the Soviet design system and the aesthetics of late socialism, the full scale of the contribution is still to be discovered. Thank you very much for your attention.
Alyona, for this incredible overview. I'm always very impressed how deep you already dived into all the archives and your huge knowledge about especially women in design, and I know from all our collaboration that you also did a lot of incredible interviews, and I think that's something that we learned during the process of or the collaboration for Retrotopia, that doing interviews, which is more known from the colleagues from the ethnological disciplines, is a very important tool also to learn and to preserve knowledge and to make it also accessible for the future generation. So thanks a lot. We will have a Q&A session at the very end, and we have still 5 more lectures ahead of us, and I have now to be hi, this is not working, sorry. Okay, just a second. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Kaja Muszyńska, working as curator at the National Museum in Warsaw, and she is also one of the co-curators of Retrotopia, and together with Anna Maga, she curated the Polish capsule, and so Kaja, the stage is yours, and we are looking very much forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Claudia, for this introduction, and thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Alyona, for coming up with this wonderful idea. I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about women in communist Poland in the design world, which includes not only women working as designers, but also women active in design-related organizations. Polish women designers of furniture, ceramics, glass, textiles, and women working as interior designers don't really need to be rediscovered in Polish design history. Many women worked in this field as professionals, gained recognition, and their work is well documented. They were not forgotten as anonymous members of studios and teams. Their designs are well represented in museums, exhibitions, and galleries. A significant number of women worked as managers and directors in organizations dedicated to design, such as the Institute of Industrial Design, Design Council, factories producing design across Poland, as well as art school and fine art academies. Mostly women wrote about design and curated museum design collections. A large number of women working in this field was the result of several factors, including the political situation, societal changes worldwide, the involvement of outstanding, determined women in design organizations, as well as the not yet established status of design as a field itself, which basically means low status of design at the time. And I haven't extensively studied the situation in other countries, although I imagine many parallels between Poland and other countries within the Eastern Bloc may exist, and comparative studies could certainly yield interesting conclusions. In recent decades, the Polish publishing market has seen a few books about women designers working in various areas. Most often they take a biographical approach, which touches on many interesting topics, but rarely introduces a gender perspective that takes into account the differences in experiences between men and women working as designers or contributing in other ways to the growth of this field in Poland. Such an approach, gender approach would allow us to ask questions about the functioning of institutions and mechanisms of power, the formation of social hierarchies, norms, customs, and practices of everyday life. Such questions may include what obstacles did women designers have to overcome? Did they have to sacrifice certain areas of their lives, such as motherhood, for instance, due to a lack of institutional support? Did the large number of women working as designers in communist Poland contribute to a more equal treatment of men and women in this field, and what circumstances made it possible for women to be active and succeed in this field in communist Poland? Were there mechanisms designed to support them, or did they benefit from intuitive actions taken by other women working as, for instance, factory directors or department chiefs within organizations, who understood their experience because they were women themselves? Also, did women designers influence women's emancipation? And if so, in what ways? These are just some of the questions one can ask by applying gender perspective. In my presentation, I won't try to answer these questions directly. Instead, I will focus on the Institute of Industrial Design in 1950s and 1960s, which is an interesting case study from a gender perspective. The Institute was the most influential design institution in communist Poland, and women were the majority of its employees. And in fact, it was run by women. Looking into such working environment may shed light on some strategies women used while working in the design arena in communist Poland. But before moving to discussing some projects of the Institute, I will just mention that works such as Kristen Gott's Second Sex, Second Word are very, very useful in understanding women designers' circumstances within Eastern Bloc, which were extremely complex and mainly from our modern perspective, because the terms developed by Western feminists of the second wave can be really directly applied. And it's also important to bear in mind that communist understanding of women emancipation differed very much from the Western one, and was equated with eliminating social differences. Western and Eastern approaches were occasionally discussed in Poland, even in lifestyle magazines, but the communist point of view definitely influenced work of Polish designers. Categories I found useful in identifying women's impact in design are, for example, they include, or the ones that were most useful to me at least, the women's agency, as well as creating supportive environment by women for other women. Okay, and now I will move to discussing the Institute. So when reading the memoirs of the Institute employees, one cannot help but be impressed by the admiration they had for Wanda Telakowska, its director. They attribute to her a special power to make things happen and use capital letters when referring to her, which in Polish grammar is mainly reserved for talking about God. In fact, one of her co-workers compared her to Demiurge. Studying Telakowska's biography, this opinion may not be exaggerated. She was undoubtedly an outstanding individual, charismatic, with a huge ability to influence people, including high-profile politicians. Before the World War II, she worked as a graphic designer and inspector of art schools. She was deeply passionate about design, and setting standards for mass and serial production in Polish design factories was her life goal. In 1947, she became the director of the Bureau of Aesthetic Control of Production, a department within the Ministry of Culture and Art. And her idea was to control the aesthetic and technical quality of design pieces made by Polish factories. She was both alarmed by the low quality of design in post-war Poland and frustrated by the insufficient manpower and resources of the Bureau to improve the situation. That's when she came up with the concept of an independent institution that would have a bigger impact on production. The idea, tailored for the centralized economy, was to hire professional designers working in different fields of design to prepare designs for mass production for factories across Poland. As a result, the structure of the institute reflected the existing industries in Poland as ceramics, furniture, glass, and textile. Additionally, the institute consisted of some administrative sections as well as sections dedicated to employees. To the development of employees, to perfecting their skills and self-development, such as a library and training section. And as I already mentioned, the majority of institute employees were women who worked on all levels, including designers, chiefs of section, and technicians. And this is not to indicate that the dominance of one gender over another is good or bad, but it is, yeah. But I see this situation, this particular case as a good opportunity to ponder if such female-dominated environment led to solutions that supported women in the workplace, or did it introduce projects or designs empowering women. And what I found interesting was the networking among women, such as academic professionals or directors of art schools, like Julia Kotarbińska from the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, or the director of art school in Zakopane, Maria Bujakowa, who recommended new employees to Telakowska. Thanks to this method, the institute gained some of the most talented designers, such as Danuta Duszniak in ceramics or Aleksandra Lewińska in textiles. Some of them were hired at the institute while still studying, which must have provided them with a certain level of financial stability and independence at a young age. Moreover, the young women recommended to Telakowska came from various social classes, which allowed some of them to improve their social status. Designers hired at the institute were offered 4 days per month for self-development, like going to the library or museums or to the park or wherever they could get inspired. Workshops, as well as some additional training, and like equally designers and technicians. From what I read in the archives, was available to anyone who was interested, to anyone who applied. The question is, were there any mechanisms or supports for, because some of this training involved leaving the city, going to another city or to another country, and I also wonder if women who had, for instance, little children, were they was it like equally available to them. And the section that employed the most women designers was, not surprisingly, the textile department. However, it like, in my opinion, it doesn't make their projects any less interesting or important. They undertook pioneering projects for the most neglected groups in this regard, such as children and workers. They succeeded in collaborating with factories, which was the most challenging part of the job for the institute designers. One fascinating project of the textile department involved 4 folk artists. This had to do with the belief of Tlakovskaya that folk patterns should be incorporated into industrial production. This topic fascinated the department's designer Lidia Buczek and Aleksandra Lewinska, who recognized its artistic, didactic, ethnographic, and social potential. Lewinska and Buczek initiated several collaborations with folk artists who traditionally were women. By working with ethnographers and using ethnographic methods, they began a collaboration with Easter egg artists from 2 villages in Lubelski region in Poland. The folk painters' task was to adapt patterns for textile printing techniques, and Buczek and Lewinska and the women artists, folk artists, developed work methods and tools together by the end of the project, an exhibition of the works was organized, and according to Buczek, the women folk artists regained respect in their village. They were happy to be given the opportunity to create again, and they also received some fees for their work, and were able to buy things they needed but couldn't afford. Some of their designs were printed in factories, and dresses were made from these fabrics, and they were sold in the shops in Lublin, which was the largest city in the region. Buczek constantly improved her methods, and before starting her next project with lace makers, she established contact with the industry, and thanks to this, many designs from these projects went into production. She also organized meetings for industry employees, during which she discussed improving production methods, and by her third project, which she started in 1964, it involved village weavers, and their designs were also produced, and even on a larger scale, and produced by a few renowned clothing enterprises in big Polish cities, and they were available in shops. These projects by Buczek and Lewinska were well documented, and the entire documentation is now in the collection of the National Museum in Warsaw. Of course, again, for our modern eyes, from our point of view, questions about appropriation of folk patterns can be asked, but in my belief, Buczek's approach seems to give agency and authorship to these folk artists. And also from today's perspective, the small fee the folk artists received is problematic, but in that system, this was probably the only way. and this is from another project from the region of Opočno. So it might be surprising that I decided to talk about textile design, which is traditionally associated with women, and instead of discussing furniture or industrial design, but I was really impressed by this project, by the sensitivity, sort of, and the need of the will of giving the voice and empowering these women whose art would otherwise be forgotten or go to waste. And as to parallelly, in my research, I'm looking for references to women experiences in the discourse around design in communist Poland. And to be honest, I'm really not surprised that I haven't found them yet, or not that many of them. And I'm not surprised, because I don't really believe that women in Poland had the language, the nomenclature that we use today to talk about these phenomena. And I also believe that this the impact of left-wing feminism, so-called, of eliminating social equalities was in fact a huge part of their work, and some of them really probably believe that this is the way of eliminating inequalities, gender inequalities as well. On the other hand, it is quite it just made me feel uncomfortable and anxious that these women designers were like trying to put themselves in the shoes of different social groups, such as physical workers, children, disabled people, but and they noticed and researched their condition, but didn't really notice their experience as women in the world, and don't even mention like this this topic in their work, because they also like in the institute, the institute workers, they also had to publish. It was obligatory to publish like pieces of written pieces on their work. Yes. So, nonetheless, I believe that work organization and topics undertaken by designers at this textile department of the institute did reflect women's experience in the world. And in my further research, I'll be looking for for traces that would indicate that they also were conscious of their own experience in the world, and that their works reflect that. And I also realized that the institute, that this what I described, like especially at the beginning, that it really sounded very utopic, but and in fact it was, because like the institute, the director, the demiurge Wanda Telakowska was in the late 60s. She was demoted by male politician who really they had the last say about her future, let's say. And also like the institute had significant impact on Polish design, on Polish of aesthetics of Polish designs, but also it's the institution itself was had utopic quality to it, because as I mentioned, as you might have noticed, as its director Wanda Telakowska was she imagined she could control the aesthetics and quality of pieces made in Polish factories, which was in the end of the day just an impossible task to realize. And yeah, that's all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kaja, for sharing your perspective, looking at women in design from a Polish perspective. I have a lot of questions, but I will keep them to the end. Now we have one speaker. I want to introduce one speaker who isn't there. So it's Cvetka Požar. She is curator at the Museum of Architecture and Design in Ljubljana, which was already founded in the 1970. Okay, she's already, the film started, so I will say something more about her later.
Hello, I'm Cvetka Požar, curator from the Museum of Architecture and Design from Ljubljana, Slovenia. First, I would like to thank you to invited me to this very important symposium. And of course, I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in Berlin, but I hope that I can give something to this very important topic with my today's pre-recorded presentation. So let me share the presentation first. So first, I will briefly present the existing studies and research on the role of women in architecture and design, as their role in Slovenian architecture and design has not yet been truly researched and is therefore overlooked. Attempts at the systematic documentation of architecture creations by women to highlight and evaluate their creativity and achievements in the course of Slovenia's architecture and design history are almost non-existent. There is no comprehensive scientific research on the role of women architects and designers, nor has there been any major study exhibition on the subjects. Till now, we'll see in the course of my lecture. I will mention one. Here, I have not considered the monographic exhibition catalogs that have been published, but compared to the monographic exhibitions of male architects and designers, much less so. Since 2016, the European project, Women's Creativity Since the Modern Movement, has been filling the gap in this area in Slovenia as well. In 2020, they published the book to the 4 female pioneers in Slovenian architecture, civil engineering and design, dedicated to the 40 female pioneers of the pre- and post-Second World War who were active in those fields. There is very little academic literature relating to Slovenia's architecture and design history, which were especially in the post-war years totally intertwined. The literature that does exist is concerned primarily with the achievements by male architects and only rarely with those where women architects acted as project authors or co-authors. In 1979, Ljubljana hosted a major retrospective curated exhibition, Slovenian Fine Arts, from 1945 to 1978, which for the first time covered architecture and design on the equal level with fine art. The exhibition catalog presented works by 139 male architects and 24 women architects, not all of whom had distinguished themselves in architecture, but also or only in industrial and graphic design. In 2004, Stane Bernik, the leading researcher of architecture and design history since the 60s, published his book Slovenian Architecture of the 20th Century, which highlights the crowning achievements of Slovenian architecture, but contains very little reference to works by Slovenian women architects. This is mostly because there had been very few instances of architectural realization by women in the 20th century. The same fact is evident in the research project Recording and Evaluation of Project of Slovenian Modern Architecture, conducted by Ljubljana Faculty of Architecture in 2000, with the aim to evaluate 50 selected projects of architectural heritage of Slovenian modernism. The research included works by 69 male architects and only 2 women architects, Majda Dubravec and Marta Ivanšek, of whom I will speak later. A further proof that works by Slovenian women architects and designers are not widely recognized is the fact that their biographies are almost non-existent in the Slovenian Biographical Lexicon, a collection of 16 volumes published by the beginning of the 90s. And the digitized version of the Slovenian Biographical Lexicon has been available since 2013 and is constantly updated. As of 2020, it contains 67 biographies of male architects and 2 of women architects. The same goes with the Encyclopedia of Slovenia, published in the beginning of 90s, also in 16 volumes, which contains only 2 entries referring to women architects. You can see the photo of the encyclopedia here. This lack of representation is even more incomprehensible regarding many progressive women architects and designers working at the end of the 80s and in the beginning of 90s. And in the light of the fact that already in 1979, the exhibition Slovenian Fine Art presented works by 24 women architects and designers. Since there has been no fundamental research on this topic, only some partial research, I have decided to present in today's lecture the diverse work of a few women architects and designers who played a pioneering role in these fields in the post-war period, when the work of women architects and designers was not yet taken for granted. The Department of Architecture at university level in Slovenia was established in 1920 at the Technical Faculty of the University of Ljubljana. The first woman architect graduated in 1932, followed by 9 more women graduated by 1945. After the war, the number of women graduates increased progressively. Between 1951 and 1961, 27 women graduated in the class of Edvard Ravnikar, the leading Slovenian architect in the second half of the 20th century. This number tripled over the next decade, bringing the total number of women graduates in the 60s to 81. Even though gender equality was an extremely important political issue in the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, such a rise in the number of women architects did not translate into equal opportunities for them in architectural and also design, in architectural planning and also design. As said, after World War II, women architects ventured into and become productive in the field of industrial design, graphic design, interior design, landscaping, fashion, costume and scene design, photography, art, teaching, and writing. Many of them were educated abroad, bringing with them new knowledge and experiences, and introducing them to Slovenian architecture practice and theory, design, landscaping, and art. In the field of architecture and design, which at this time in the beginning of 90s began to establish itself as a profession in Slovenia, the first wave of socialist modernization was strongly marked by modernism, the post-war reconstruction and the new socialist social order in which architecture, especially housing architecture, was given a new social function, both placed the housing problem and improving the housing culture of the entire population at the forefront of their efforts. So now I will present works by a few Slovenian architects, which acted already which were active already in the 50s. First is architect Branka Tancik. She was one of the first architects to play a very important role in the establishment of a new housing culture as early as the 50s. She graduated in architecture in 1954 with her graduation work titled Contemporary Kitchen. Soon after graduation, she became employed at the Center for the Advancement of Households, where she was active in different fields, including the design of educational and care establishments, furnishing of hotel and school kitchens, and home economic classrooms. Most of all, she has focused on introducing modern laboratory kitchen into Slovenian apartments. The first industrially produced kitchen elements come on the market in 1955. In the second half of the 50s, the kitchen was installed in apartments, in new housing estates in Maribor and Ljubljana. Branka Tancik also actively pursued this topic in her further professional career, contributing to the development of the dimensional coordination and the basis for the design of kitchen equipment for both the federal and republican norms for housing construction. She also wrote extensively on the subject in professional journals such as Architect magazine, as well as in more popular ones such as Contemporary Households, for which she also designed the covers. Already in the 50s, many women architects, some I'm mentioning also today, were published extensively on the subject of housing furnishing, ranging from books and manuals, critical analytical contributions to purely practical articles in which they gave advice on how to furnish a modern apartment economically, especially with an efficient use of space, but at the same time affordably. Architect Marta Ivanšek worked in housing construction, which she tackled comprehensively, from urban planning of residential areas to housing and interior design. Here are some of her early, here is one of her early work, interior design for the shop which sold craft products in the center of Ljubljana. So one more really, and yeah, and from homes for the everyday user. Here is an example of the kitchen that she designed with her husband in the beginning of 60s. And and to those adapted for people with special needs. Next to design, her work included housing research and awareness raising about the importance of housing culture. Between 1954 and 1959, she lived in Stockholm with her husband Francej Ivanšek, and they both worked in various architecture offices. On the basis of their Swedish experience, they developed their interest in housing research, broadened their understanding of housing construction, shaped both their technical and artistic approach to interior design, and developed a sensitivity to groups of people with special needs, especially the elderly. Here are some examples from the home for homes for elderly people that they designed. Also the building, they did the architecture and also the interior design with furnished with furniture that they designed. After their return in 1959 to Slovenia, they both worked at the Urban Planning Institute Slovenia, and then in 1963 founded their own bureau, Studio for Housing and Interior Design. The studio had both a design and a research department, published books and manuals, and organized exhibitions such as contemporary interior design. From the 1964. The studio had 2 showrooms and stores managed mostly by Marta Ivanšek, the interior in Ljubljana and the ambient in Maribor, where they sell Slovene and Scandinavian design objects. Yeah, so this is very important contribution of Ivanšek's to the design culture in Slovenia in the 60s and also in the 70s. Architect Majda Dubravec, as Ravnikar's assistant between 1960 and 1962, co-created the B course program, which was a key part of the reform of studies at the Faculty of Architecture at that time, and at the same time, the first design education program at university level in Slovenia. She has also transferred the experience of B course, which emphasizes the multifaceted nature of an architect's work, to all areas of her work, from architecture design, interior design, graphic design, and journalism. Her early articles published in the magazine Architect and Synthesa testify to the commitment of the young architect who excitedly analyzed many of the issues of architecture and design that were topical at the time, for example, such as the importance of institutions for research and development activities and educational work. For her, architecture was not just a functional building and a solution to technical problems, but a space in which the lives of its users unfold. She was more interested in the relationship with the local context than in the abstract formal language of modernist architecture, which is most evident in her most frequently published project, the primary school in Kranjska Gora in Slovenia. The school, now destroyed by the renovations, represented one of the best examples of so-called critical regionalism in Slovenia. Here we have a plan also. She also designed a number of posters, visual identities, design of magazines, books, and book jackets, which makes her one of the pioneers of Slovenian modern graphic design. In June this year, the Museum of Architecture and Design in Ljubljana opened the first retrospective exhibition of the architect and designer Janja Lapp, and at the same time, the first scientific monograph of the work of a woman architect and designer in Slovenia was published on the same occasion. Until now, Janja Lapp was best known as a glass designer. But thorough research of her archive revealed that she was much more than that. After graduating in the 1950s, she immediately started working on the architectural and urban planning projects. In the early 60s, she continued her studies at the Royal College of Art in London, participating in scientific research carried out by professors Misha Black and Bruce Archer. Between 1965 and 1966, she was part of a research group on hospitals at the RCA, focusing on the advantages and disadvantages of hospitals' food systems. The research hospital feeding system formed the basis of her master thesis titled Communal Feeding Systems, which she completed at the RCA in 1973. A major turning point in this was that she put the user and the people involved in the preparing the food rather than the product, for example, the food serving tray, at the center of her research. She then taught for over 10 years at the Sheffield School of Architecture and the Architectural Association in London. She also continued her scientific research, focusing on improving the quality of nutrition for the most vulnerable populations, school children, and on design in crisis situations, for example, from war to earthquake. She was an accomplished glass designer and industrial designer in the technologically advanced Iskra company after returning from England in the late 70s, and an extremely incisive scientific researcher dedicated to systemic solutions to complex social problems. This is her pioneering contribution to a broader understanding of the role of design in society. In conclusion, I would like to introduce an architect, Seta Mušić, who is the pioneer of Slovenian television set design. After her graduated in 1958, she started working in Ljubljana television, where she remained for more than 3 decades. She first worked as an architect and took over the reconstruction of the old radio building into a new television studio. After that, she completely dedicated her work to the television scenography. Her rich collection of work comprises more than 2,000 set designs, with which she left the incredible inventive mark on the television in Ljubljana. She created imaginative set designs in dialogue with contemporary art trends and specially adapted to the television medium. 5 Impressions, which was a ballet show, is a pioneering achievement both in the field of television image design, which intervenes in the mass media with an exquisite visual media space, as well as in the field of new thinking about space in which the characters are located in a completely new world without a physical context. I have briefly presented only 4 women architects whose work had a significant impact on the housing culture and in general on the culture of living in the second half of the 20th century in Slovenia. There are many others whom I have not mentioned, but whose work should be researched and analyzed so that they can be included in the architecture and design history canon. So again, thank you very much for having me here, and I wish you all a really productive and successful afternoon. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mary Pepchinski, and she was a professor for architecture and society at the Technical University Dresden until her retirement in 2021. And she has created several exhibitions on the topic of women in architecture, and she was also the curator and editor of the catalogue of this exhibition Frau Architekt, over 100 years of women in architecture. This was an exhibition which took place at the Museum of Architecture in Frankfurt. And she's a real expert on that topic, and I'm extremely honored, or we are extremely honored that you made your way to Berlin. You have not been involved so far in the exhibition Retrotopia, so it's really great that you share your experience and your research with us on women architects in East and West. And you will also afterwards moderate the Q&A at the end of all our lectures. So please, Mary, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much.
You need some... Okay, some more?
I should be okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And how do I make this go forward? Like that?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, Claudia, thank you very much, and thank you for coming and for organizing this symposium. And by the way, that my title is Women Architects in East and West, 1945 to 1990, Differences, Similarities. Somehow common sense got into some publication somewhere. So, we are here today to explore the contributions of women architects during the period of state socialism in Europe. Not only their buildings, but also the careers of these women offer insight into the extent to which socialism was able to upend deeply entrenched attitudes towards gender and remunerative work. For example, did state socialism offer women architects greater professional opportunities when compared to democratic capitalism? And, despite ideological claims to gender equality, did traditional attitudes towards female competency, creativity, and intellectual capacity endure throughout the period of state socialism? Inspired by these questions, the Hungarian architect and architecture theory professor Marian Zeman and I set out to identify some answers in our 2017 co-edited publication, Ideological Equals, Women Architects in Socialist Europe, with contributions from colleagues in Estonia, Germany, Hungary, Macedonia, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And as you see by this selection, our framing of this historical period was governed by post-1990 identities and boundaries of Eastern Europe and not the historical circumstance themselves. It's also something to discuss, how we frame the past. As much gender theory and gender history about architecture and design in the 20th century has been produced in the West and addresses conditions under capitalism, we also wanted to expand this literature by considering the situation of women in a completely different political and economic system, namely state socialism. So the answers that we found in Ideological Equals are inspiring and sobering. Although women made extraordinary gains in architecture, particularly when compared to their sisters in the West, under democratic capitalism, age-old prejudice towards feminine abilities stubbornly endured. However, the eastern side of the Iron Curtain was by no means a unified or even a coherent condition, and the intersections of gender, the profession of architecture, and the system of state socialism varied considerably throughout the nations of Eastern Europe. Beginning in the 1950s, women under state socialism throughout the Eastern Europe were mobilized to enter the workforce. As we can see here by this article in the East German magazine Die Frau von heute, or The Woman of Today, young women were encouraged to pursue a career in technical fields like agronomy, architecture, or clothing engineering. That they were also being encouraged to have children. To undertake full-time work and parenting, they enjoyed support from the state, in the form of political equality, reproductive rights, and extensive social services like daycare, public laundries, and cafeterias. Throughout Eastern Europe, male and female architects were sorely needed to contribute to the reconstruction and modernization efforts following World War II. Although there were very few women architects overall, the situation differed from nation to nation. In some nations like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, or the provinces of Slovenia and Serbia and Yugoslavia, women had been working in architecture starting in the first half of the 20th century, while in other nations like Slovakia, they only appeared after 1950. Architecture, typically located at the technical universities, appealed to them. And by the end of the 1970s, women were strongly represented at architecture faculties and had achieved parity with men in nations like Romania and East Germany, had even surpassed them by the end of the decade in East Germany. With the establishment of people's republics in the late 1940s, private architectural practice was largely abolished, and following the Soviet model, large collective state-run offices were established. Once she completed her education, a woman typically entered a state-run office, often remaining in the same place of employment for the duration of her career. Depending upon where they were located, these offices could range in size from 20 people or so, I'm told, in the Baltic states, to upwards of thousands in some of the larger nations. Taken collectively, women worked on a variety of projects, from office buildings and artistic institutions, to cultural and exhibition buildings, which revealed a sensitivity to site, materials, and landscape, to all kinds of housing, from inner-city apartment towers, new urban quarters constructed using standardized building components, low-scale, quasi-suburban apartment blocks, and holiday vacation camps for children and youth. Tasks varied from nation to nation, reflecting local needs and traditions, available building materials, and the ability to innovate within the framework of the local construction industry. Yet long-held assumptions about innate feminine ability or competence and incompetence often endured. For example, in Hungary during the 1950s, during the late 1940s and early 1950s, women architects were responsible for industrial buildings and large-scale infrastructure, as we see here on the right. By contrast, in Ljubljana, and the presentation that we just saw, the focus was on the students of Edvard Raptikar, and he was the leading modernist in Ljubljana in Slovenia at the architecture faculty at the School of Architecture. There were actually 4 professors, and Raptikar was the modernist. He was the most important one. In the early 50s, there was 3 others, and one was Jože Plečnik, who dies in 1956, but he was considered aging, obsolete, a crazy old guy who talked about mysticism, and everybody drew things, with their hand, and made little candle holders instead of big buildings. Anyway, that's where the women initially in Slovenia were sent. And you actually then had women who went out and then became important architects, but I just show this contrast. In Hungary, they were allowed to do industry, and you just hop over the border in Slovenia, and you might be doing hand drawings of something very traditional. So this is sort of this at this moment in time. So there could be such differences among the nations. Some women had access to foreign travel, such as those in Yugoslavia, a non-aligned nation outside of the Warsaw Pact. Others enjoyed professional contacts to regions or architects in particular areas of the world. Beginning with its founding in 1963, Hungarian women were extremely prominent in the international women's organization, the UEFA, Union Internationale des Femmes Architectes. Traveling to international conferences in Western Europe and the United States and Iran, and taking on leadership positions. And here is the Hungarian delegation by the meeting in Paris with their exhibition in 1983. When they rose to positions of authority, women architects found themselves engaging with the prevailing political structures. Some saw their allegiance primarily to their nation, and viewed their architecture as contributing to modernization and advancement, not a political agenda. Nevertheless, it was surprising to discover several, actually there were surprisingly a number of projects by women for the Communist Party. In Romania, Anca Petrescu, a party member, became the public face of the House of the People. In Bucharest, mediating between Nicolae Ceausescu's wishes, notably his unbridled desire for monumental historicism, and the staff of hundreds who implemented his ideas. By contrast, in Slovakia, Vera Mekova, who was not a party member but a highly experienced and very accomplished architect, had much more creative freedom in adapting her own formal research into large visionary structures with idiosyncratic yet sensual forms for the offices of the Regional Committee of the Slovak Communist Party in Zlín. It was also sobering to learn that during state socialism, women rarely rose to the most prestigious and powerful professional positions, and this was true in architecture as well. Nevertheless, as we see by these popular publications from East Germany, it was often the youthful, wholesome woman architect who embodied the optimism and gender ideology of state socialism, whose work in architecture was literally building up the socialist state, and one finds images of this youthful woman architect starting in the 1960s to kind of symbolize these ideals of the state. The image in the center, though, is telling as it shows a woman architect balancing her toddler on her knee while surveying a building site. As previously mentioned, despite full-time employment, women were expected to shoulder the second shift of caring for a home and family. And some historians of this period cite this double load to explain why very few women rose to positions of influence and power. After all, they work full-time, they take care of a family, who has time for political activity. Others, though, point to the low share of women compared to men who became Communist Party members, perhaps an indication of women's collective ambivalence towards this political system, and perhaps another explanation for their absence from the highest levels of professional accomplishment. The situation in East Germany was unique because it existed in tandem with the partner nation that is West Germany, with which it shared a pre-war architecture culture with its accompanying traditions and attitudes towards gender. What then were the consequences for women architects? As noted, women architects had emerged in Germany starting around 1900, yet they were greeted with derision and skepticism regarding their intellectual and creative abilities, prejudice that would endure throughout the 20th century. Immediately after 1945, yet prior to Berlin's division in 1949, we find women architects participating in rubble clearance, demolition, and reconstruction efforts throughout the city. After the founding of the two German states in 1949, their situations diverge. In the West, women were expected to be wives and mothers. Until 1976, they had to accept a husband's authority regarding their money, ability to work, etc. They lacked reproductive rights and only began studying at universities in larger numbers and entering the professions in the 1960s, and the advent then of the birth control pill at the same time allows them also more professional freedom. In East Germany, as noted, women had political parity, reproductive rights, were expected to work full-time and raise a family. And the architecture historian Tanja Scheffler, who mainly researches architecture in former East Germany, has noted that in East Germany in the 1950s, men initially resented the presence of women in the new collective offices, and only in the 1960s, after millions had fled East Germany, including many architects, thus depleting the ranks of the profession, that male architects were finally more open to accepting women as colleagues. In East Germany, this support for women paid off, and by 1970, 30% of the architecture students were women, a share that rose to around 60% by the end of the decade. In West Germany, by contrast, their percentages rose from around 10% to circa 30% in the early 1980s. Quantitatively, there was a greater percentage of women entering compared to how many are studying than how many go on to enter the profession, enter and then remain in the profession of architecture in the East. They had more advantageous conditions. They were guaranteed a job. There was access to daycare and childcare if they started a family, etc. In the West, as we all know, upon graduation, there is no job guarantee. And especially in West Germany, when women were actually expected to stay home if they had children, few social services, so it was very hard to navigate a career, much harder in the West than in the East. And it's not surprising that for many women architects in the West who went on to have a family, they very often worked in collaboration with the husband, so they were able to then coordinate all these different tasks. Thus, becoming an architect for a woman was much more difficult in West Germany than it was in East Germany, and the interviews that I've done with my research and the people that I've spoken to over the decades now always say that if they were an East German woman, I'm so happy that my career took place in East Germany and not in West Germany. So, what happened in East Germany? In East Germany, the state-run offices placed emphasis on the technical dimension of design. In these offices, women architects were active in a range of specialties: urban design, housing, cultural, educational, and recreational buildings, interior and landscape design, etc. Yet women rarely assumed the most powerful or prestigious roles, like being head of a collective or acting as a chief city architect, which was the most prized position that an architect could aspire to, because you were like the head of an office. You had a lot of autonomy. You could decide what projects were going to happen. It was like running a big private office, let's say, if you're in the West. So that was the most prestigious job that an architect could probably have. And all larger cities, small scale to larger cities, had a chief city architect. Over the course of 4 decades, only 3 women were appointed to the post of chief city architect, as historian Harold Engler notes. And when this happened, as was the case of Iris de Lien-Grun in Neubrandenburg, where her accomplishments include a major cultural building and a city extension for 50,000 inhabitants, this occurred in a small provincial city, not in a mainstream center of power. In West Germany, private practice with an emphasis on the creative aspects of architecture was dominant, and women made wide-ranging contributions. Most architectural offices were run by men, and as I mentioned, considering the challenges of uniting work and a family, it's not surprising that when women did then establish their office, it was with a husband. Okay. One noteworthy West German woman architect, Lucy Hillebrand, began her career in the 1920s. After 1945, she ran her office in Göttingen, which is in Hessen, building residential architecture and social infrastructure. She was also a prominent public intellectual who directed films on architectural theory, appeared on TV, and was the subject of a 1988 exhibition at the Gesamthochschule Kassel. Today it's the University of Kassel. Alla, this is something for you, something to research in the future. Like de Lien-Grun, her success occurred in a small provincial city, this time in West Germany. Although there were more fortuitous conditions for women in architecture in the East and in the West, it is worth noting that by the end of the 1980s, there was only one tenured woman professor for architecture at the highest academic level in East Germany, namely Anita Bach at the Hochschule für Architektur und Bauwesen, the HAB in Weimar, today the Bauhaus University Weimar. At the same time, there was only one tenured woman professor for architecture at the highest academic level in West Germany. It's actually West Berlin, namely Ingeborg Kuhler at the Hochschule der Künste, HDK, today the University of the Arts in West Berlin. Different systems notwithstanding, when one gets to the top, the results were the same. Certainly a comparison of women architects in East and West Germany can continue and be carried out in greater depth. And certainly, as this brief survey suggests, women architects in East Germany achieved a much greater quantitative success regarding their relative numbers, so the numbers who studied, then went into the profession and stayed there, than their colleagues in the West, or West Germany. Due to the system of collective state-run offices, I also suspect they had greater opportunities to work on very large-scale, complex projects, opportunities which far outstripped those that were offered to many women who were active in West Germany. It was not selbstverständlich for the woman architect, regardless if she hailed from East Germany or West Germany, to rise to the highest levels of the profession. In answer to the question proposed at the start of this talk, did state socialism offer women architects greater professional opportunities when compared to democratic capitalism? The answer is yes, but to only a certain extent. Or as gender researchers Christiane Droste and Sandra Hunning observe in their chapter for Frau Architekt, quote, the experiences of women architects on both sides of the Iron Curtain clearly had things in common, end quote. Thank you. And if you're interested in this topic, I recommend Ideological Equals, the text by Sandra Hunning, Christiane Droste, Tanja Scheffler in the Frau Architekt catalog. Tanja's also written extensively about, or starting to publish more now about women architects in the GDR. And there's my latest Women Architects in Politics, which I co-edited with Christina Buddha, who's also on the Frau Architekt team, which is available for open access, where some of these themes are talked as well. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mary, for this extremely interesting input, also comparing the conditions, working conditions of women in East and West, and I think there will be a lot of questions which we will have later on. So now our next speaker is again a dear co-curator of Retrotopia, namely Helena Huber-Doudová. She is also a specialist in architecture and head of the architectural department at the National Gallery in Prague. And this year she was also the curator of the Czech Pavilion at the Biennial in Venice. And you brought to our exhibition the Hotel Thermal, and which has been built by the same architects than the Czech embassy in Berlin. I hope you all know the Czech embassy, and maybe you will also talk about the mechanisms. So Helena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and also to the project of Retrotopia, which was such a huge undertaking, actually, with like so many international partners, and I think it's just an amazing result, getting all of these people, but also objects and all of this information together for the first time. Because for me, it was also quite surprising how many things I do not know, actually. So thank you for the initiative with the Retrotopia exhibition, and also Alyona for the panel on women, because it was interesting to see that young researchers are actually working on the same topics. So that's why I'm particularly happy to be able to speak here about our current project. Here you see the photo from an architecture commune from Liberec. It's the renowned SIA studio, and it was like the most competitive studio in Czech. It was located in northern Bohemia, and out of this studio, actually, the most well-known architects actually come from, who are like professors and deans and all of that of architecture schools nowadays. And you can see there the architect in the bottom right, Helena Huber-Doudová, who actually decided to play the ball game with the guys. There was another woman architect, Dana Zamečníková. When I was talking to her briefly, she said, well, architecture is not a profession for women. It was so competitive that if you can't do the profession for 150%, you just should leave. And she actually did. And she went to do more scenography, and But there were women who persisted, but it's obvious that that it was not easy at that time for women in this male-dominated profession to get involved in and become part of the game, so to say. We are now working in the National Gallery in cooperation with the Academy of Arts, Architecture and Design in Prague on a research project. It's our last year. We are a team of 5. And it's a research project funded by the Czech Science Foundation. So I will just briefly say what are the objectives and project elements. I'm the co-lead together with Claudia Banz, who is a colleague of mine, and then we have 3 or actually 4 more researchers. So we are 6, and we are kind of mapping the work of women. We are interpreting the results of the research in terms of history with interdisciplinary overlap. We are actually questioning the canon and the notion of creative genius, and actually what the architecture profession as such means, and how to look at it in terms of feminist approach. And then as the result, we are kind of publishing, exhibiting, and in general trying to raise awareness about women architects in Czech and also internationally. So it was not easy in the beginning because there was only basically 3 women architects who were better known. So we started archive research, which didn't go that far. We were then researching professional journals, and we found about 200 names of women architects who were published, but they were very little known. So we figured we have to go with the methodology and start doing interviews and also visit these women, because as I will be speaking about it later, the estates of these women are not in the institutional archives. They're in private archives, and they're mostly endangered. So there is very little material we can actually work with. We are creating an internet database of 100 biographies of women architects, and now we are working on a publication. And what we actually do in the National Gallery is when we kind of encounter this private archive of a woman, we are digitizing this material, and if these women kind of consent, then we take this and try to make it an acquisition in the collection of the National Gallery, because as you will see, the numbers are actually quite horrifying in terms of representation of women in institutional collections and museums. Now, just briefly, the database. It's a tool for online publishing, and we programmed the database and now a website. And we have 3 pillars: biographies, objects, and themes, because we didn't want to go just the monographic way of thinking. So we are kind of trying to have also podcasts, the voices of these women, and then link through keywords also objects and themes. Now, the expanded field of collecting and exhibiting. So I was kind of trying to do a feminist rethinking, being in the National Gallery. I was kind of trying to do the feminist rethinking of the subject of architecture. Also, who is doing architecture, and what does it mean to be a woman in the profession? Then object of architecture, especially in the collection and archive, and how does the institution have to change in order to be more open to involve actually the works of women. So I came up with this diagram. I will then show you what are the different layers of this diagram. But in terms of how to deal with women in architecture, we are often dealing with a canon, and I also draw a lot on Griselda Pollock, who is saying that there were different approaches, either you enhance the canon, the already existing list of well-known names and authors, or you try to focus on specificity, so meaning that you actually emphasize something that is special for women, meaning that you say, okay, women were better designers, or women had like, you know, like some specific tasks that they were doing better than men, or the third approach, which I think is actually the best, is...
Sorry, du bist ein bisschen...
Yeah?
Nicht so dicht. Sorry. Bisschen
Is it
weiter
better?
weg, ja.
Yeah, okay. So I think the best way to approach this topic is to apply like this difference, this deconstruction, and then go to beyond this binary opposition of man and woman, and to say, okay, like design and architecture is a field, it's a cultural field, a dynamic field that changes in time, and these roles, gender roles, also change in time. Meaning that also the notion of architecture is a subject of change. So I draw on this expanded field of Rosalind Krauss, and she was like referring to sculpture, and that sculpture didn't really work with the sculpture in the 60s and 70s did not really comply with the disciplinary definition of culture, and she was trying to expand it via architecture and landscape. And I was kind of taking this logic because, from my perspective, architecture as a definition of constructing, building, and material does not really comply with what women did in architecture mostly, because what they did was like interior design, and they were actually also included in the everyday mediation. They did like works on the intersection with public space and installation. So actually it was something that was not architecture, or what is normally not considered architecture. And that led me to this diagram, basically, that architecture should be extended towards the field of design and everyday and living environment. And in these different poles of this square, you also have this action and network as relationships, because women were quite often included in publication, in doing exhibitions, in just being support and mediators, also within the state offices. And then on the other hand, as from what we were researching, we found out that a lot did like exhibitions, installations, and public space assignments. They also a lot like work with artists, like for instance, and the Prague Metro and so on. So for me, this was like a broader notion of architecture as living environment, which I think one could apply also for the definition of an object of architecture for the collections. Yeah. Then the expanded subject I already mentioned a little bit. This is a diagram from one exhibition on women architects in Czechoslovakia, which is like very unique, which we discovered. Nobody knew about it actually, because I mean there were no emancipatory steps towards architecture or women in architecture. There was never a journal published on women in architecture in Czechoslovakia, so it was quite a revelation for us when we discovered that there was an exhibition of 27 women architects from Moravia, from southeast, and and this is a drawing from the catalog, like a logo. It's the Vitruvian Man who by Leonardo from end of 15th century, which is like paraphrased, and these proportions are actually turned to a woman architect. And I figured out that if I lay it over this geometric square, then I get like some kind of a holistic view, but whatever. But anyways. So the story of the canon and of this modern subjectivity was actually oriented towards like the modern artist and the free artistic genius, which was already constructed by Vitruvius in this like biographical Le Vita, and we know that like how this canon is actually constructed. based on like this big artworks and major world commissions, networks, and so forth. Which and obviously there is, as Mary Pepchinski mentioned, there's many prejudices against women in the profession, that women cannot work on the building site, that women don't have any spatial imagination. That's an older one, and all kinds of things like that women can only like draw and. And they were basically, women were always delegated to the lower ranks of the profession. They were like technical drawers quite often, even though they were educated architects. And they were only quite not that often included in this like author team of the commission. So women were not perceived, even in the 50s and the 60s, as these like creative geniuses, and this was even in the socialist system, where this authorship, one would say that there were like state planning offices. It was not a capitalist system, so you didn't have to sort of sell anything, and there was like some kind of a more leveled situation between men and women, like. You didn't have to create like your kind of brand in order to get more commissions and so on. But this was not the case, and women were actually not that equally treated, and their authorship was also not recognized. So that's why it was so surprising for us to find this exhibition on Moravian architects, where they really state like we feel that our achievements are not being recognized, and there were portraits of 27 women who were working on the full scale of building commissions, from schools and interior design towards heritage protection, but also, as Mary Pepchinski noted, on power plants. So, I mean, that was quite unique in socialism, that you were actually basically like in some kind of like specialized state planning office that was either for like healthcare production or for telephone and transitions and so on, and then you did like specialized tasks. You were not actually commissioning like private houses or anything like. So that's why these women were actually like working, as a part of this like work system on all kinds of commissions. Now, if I move on to. So there was just a brief summary, and if I move on to the gender check of women in architecture in collections, I was actually concerned with that because I was in the National Gallery also working with art collection, and I found out it's not that easy, because even though we have about 30 women's names listed among 220 nowadays, 22 names. So it's only like women as co-authors, and we don't have like much of the comprehensive documentation. We had only 4 women out of 220 when I actually took over the collection, which I thought was quite sad. So like 220 male is total, and out of them like 4 women's estates was quite sad. But I figured that we are not an exception, because in the Netherlands, out of 690 authors' archives, there are only 26 women's names. I mean, there was even less, I think, 3 years ago. The German Architecture Museum is out of 486 authors' archives. There are only 13 female authors, 11 couples, and 4 women are listed as artists. the architecture archive of the Akademie der Künste in Berlin. There are 71 authors, archives, and 80 collections, but none is a single woman architect. I think that's like really alarming. And only 2 architects' archives are husband and wife pairs, and the Reebok collection, they don't list these numbers, but I think it will be like similar. So, I mean, I didn't consult the curators, maybe something changed, but this was the information. It was presented in internet and in the museum catalogs. I did like more precise inquiries in the Czech Republic, but the situation was very similar. And you could count the number of women's estates on 1 or 2 hands. So it was up to 10. And there's also like one complicating issue, that if you have a collection, I mean, normally you can't really, like when you have an electronic system, you can't look up gender. I don't know how you have it in the museum, but there's no way. I mean, in Czech we have an ending, ova, but it's not full because not everyone has this ending, So you can list have an idea how many works are there in Czech in the collection. I guess in Germany it's not possible because there is no chance. So if you don't have these like author fonts, but you have just like media fonts, like I don't know, like textiles, design, whatever, chairs, furniture. It's extremely difficult to actually find out how many women are there and how many works of the women are in the collection. So that's something I encountered in the Applied Arts Museum in Prague, that they were not able to tell me actually at all this information. So there's like a lot of like complicating moments on these like listing and the numbers of, but generally it's like very little. So I was also concerned with the notion of becoming archival, which specified Albena Janeva. It's like scrutinizing the specific mechanism of production of archive in design practice. So if an object is taken into a museum, it receives like an aura of exclusivity, and its origin, it's isolated from the original context into a new context. It becomes like something that is part of a new juxtaposition, new history making, scholarly research, and so forth. So that's why it's so crucial that women's archives are actually part of the museums. And what I found out about women's archives, it was very inspiring for me to read an article on the International Archive of Women in Architecture. And I found out also from my experience working with the women and making interviews that these archives are very fragmentary because women were in the lower ranks in the profession. Another crucial thing is that the documentation of the project stays in the possession of the studio leader or the husband, meaning that in the professional couples you actually don't, and they are not on good matters, you actually don't even have access to the original documentation. Another problem I encountered was that there is, or I have the feeling there's a weak connection of women to their work, meaning that sometimes they just throw everything away. And because they feel that their calling is not as strong and they didn't live for architecture, they also have their families and they also have their communities. So we have, even very important, I will show, women architects who actually, they don't have the archives anymore. And it's more even complicated because, as this Mika Bliznakov says, since women's work was seldom mentioned by the press, the archive of the designer herself becomes the only source of information. So if you don't even have this only source of information, so how can you actually prove that the woman was doing anything important, and you don't have the interview because a lot of them are already dead. So with some women you have the feeling they are actually quite important, but you don't have the material actually to construct anything. So it's so fragmentary, and you have just these fragments, and you have to do much more reconstruction than with the men's estates. And then there are also like false or missing attributions, which already Alyona mentioned, by male authors, that they actually take the authorship of some artwork, but also by media, that there is only one author named, and women as collaborators are not named over the time. You know, it's just like repeating like this one author. So the women get slowly erased from art history, and also in collections. So like what I encountered in our collection is that when when a woman is a collaborator on a project, and the estate comes with the architect, nobody knows who did like some kind of drawings, meaning it's all listed under the name of the architect or the architect's firm or the closest collaborators, even though the woman, like for instance you'll see Zdenka Nováková, her drawings were quite important for like important pavilions and so on, but she was not listed in the collection as an author, because either the people didn't know. I mean, it doesn't have to be intentional, you know, that's just the way how it is, because the women don't actually possess their archives. That's problematic. So this is like case number one, Ivana Čapková, where there is no archive. Ivana Čapková is quite an important person. She was a researcher. She is a researcher. One of the first assistants in a design studio in Prague, at an Academy of Applied Arts, meaning that these academies were really like not accessible for women. She then got kicked out for political reasons, and she was allowed to get back to the academy only in 1990. And in the between, she did research in the Special Institute on housing culture. She was also very active in journalism, and she actually achieved like her habilitation in 1992 and 93. So she really was like one of those like important women in the architecture scene, but she did not perceive her work as important. So she just threw like large parts of the drawing simply away. She was thinking very much typologically. She did exhibitions, quite provocative, also like dealing with the problems of socialist design production and this seriality and this uniformity. One of these exhibitions was for 500,000 new flats, which they furnished with because it was like this large-scale housing building construction. And they were supposed to design like furnishings for 500 new flats, 500,000. So they took like the most universal furniture called Universal, and they furnished the whole apartment with this universal furniture, which was quite controversial. But anyways, so then she did drawing where she was analyzing the problems of these flats, how big these housing furnitures like in the living room are, and that you don't have any communicative lines anymore, because the sitting furniture, the bed, and the main drawer cupboard, which we actually have in the exhibition, that's the radical. That's the radical like housing or furniture wall that Rostislav Koryčánek was selecting. So it was like completely like, with these three elements, like this living room wall, this living room sofa, and this like large bedroom bed, you could like completely kill the whole apartment, and then she was also doing like these infographics and this like sort of Neufeld type of thing where you can actually read like these prejudices of like what type of furniture and what measurements you have in the kitchen for women, and the men, there was like a working table always or a piano, so there were like measurements for the men for the piano and so on. So that was like quite funny, and we had that book also in the exhibition. And then also like one quite unique collaboration she had with an architect who then emigrated 1975 to 77 to Austria after signing the Charter 77. Helena Bukowanska. So and except for that, she did like a number of like commercial interiors, playgrounds, parks, and we don't have that documentation, unfortunately. Case number 2 is Helena Huber-Doudová. That's the architect from the beginning. She was part of this architects commune. So these are the materials we are kind of documenting and digitizing in the National Gallery, where we kind of managed to get these estates. So Helena Huber-Doudová was part of this CL commune, and she was one of the very few architects who was able to actually, you see the people how they really lived in this laboratory of architecture, I would say. There was a very intense sort of living and working environment, including playing basketball in the architecture studios and so on. She did very interesting projects, like her school projects. She proposed like an inflatable structure for the Old Town Square in Prague, where there was like some kind of a performative exhibition on sanitation, where people were to look at like different films on sanitation, and then also like break the sanitation furniture, and you could get like pieces of this sanitation and take it with you home. So it was kind of like a surreal thing, and she was definitely also influenced by Marcel Duchamp, because this inflatable pavilion was supposed to be in the form of like this toilet. And then she was in Sial, and she was doing a lot of ski aerials and commissions for winter sports, but she was also pregnant during that time. Then they immigrated to Holland. She even had a guest professorship at Delft and at RWTH Aachen, when they were kind of looking for women architects to become professors. And then she divorced her husband. So it is really tragic that like this woman with like her full career of doing like housing, schools in Holland with like ecological and sustainable principles. She does not, or like the Maritime Museum competition, or an realized competition for the Czech Center in Paris and so on. She is not in possession of these plans, and these plans are possessed by her husband. And since they are not on a particular good terms, it's in his actually power if he will take her as an author or co-author or not, like in publication, because he has these all original materials, and what she gave us was basically like of the later projects only like these Xerox copies, which you can't work with that properly. So that is like really difficult situation. Or of this like Czech Center in Paris, and she only has like some kind of a leaflet that was like published with documentation. So I think it's not easy to work with women's archives, and And the case number 3 is Zdenka Nováková. So this is this case of attribution. Zdenka Nováková, she was the first teaching like tenure track professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, and she taught there from 1968 till 1990. When she was 24, they won a commission for a big administration building you see on the top. They worked with an Italian firm called Fel, and they did like this hanging facade, glass facade. So they were like really courageous as like very young girls, and because she was like so capable, she always collaborated with like the big names and big like important men. For instance, František Zuber, he was his assistant at the Academy of Fine Arts, or Karel Filzak, who built all different kinds of embassies. They collaborated on the Expo 1967 with Zuber, and you see her visualizations. She was a very, very gifted painter, and she did these spatial perspectives, which then were actually realized. But for instance, in our collection, it is listed under the architect's name, not her, because I mean, either you would have to know it, or it's if somebody is just like without the proper knowledge, he will just take these things as they are. The same is with these interiors of this Hotel Intercontinental, which she did for Karel Filzak. It's the same thing, that she is not in possession of these originals. I have been to the personal archive of Karel Filzak, and there's like all these photographies and all these plans are basically there. So the studio leader actually collected all of these like perspectives and all of these visualizations, and it stayed then in the end in his archive. So unless it's really signed, it's really difficult to discern the name of who drew what. So finally in the 80s she became more independent in her work, but the commissions were not that important anymore. And then she did a lot of exhibitions. She did exhibitions for the National Gallery. She did refurbishments of different like churches, and she did receive some state prizes, but she never did like these really major commissions that like she did like when she was really young. So one can obviously as well ask what happened, and why these women were then, if they were like really good, why they were not given like professorships or anything like that at the Academy of Fine Arts, for example. So yeah, that would be more or less all from my side. So this different notion of a subject in architecture would have to like then have an impact on what type of material one is collecting, because there is so little documentation. So in these collections, one should actually like take more or less everything, including like artworks of these women and so forth, because there's like so little things how to reconstruct what these women actually did, that you should take also like written material and all personal photographies that actually help to, unless you have some kind of an interview, but it's still like not enough. So it made me rethink about like what in a collection, because normally we have like thousands of plans, like huge perspective, negatives, photographies, and just the standard documentation of architecture. But coming to this like problem of women in architecture, I just like, and working with these women and looking at what they have, I figured we have to, for instance, also take like these Xerox copies as a museum object, because we don't have anything else, and you know that you are not going to exhibit this because it's not representative, and it's not nice. It's like a cheap A4 copy. So that's it, but like that's what you have to work with. But it's important from the like research perspective. So that is actually like what I wanted to say, that still it is like with this very little a number of women in institutional archives, you know, it's something that one should really address.
Thank you very much, Helena, for sharing your research. I think this is a problem that we all are facing, also working in museums. And if you would ask me how many female designers we have in our collection, I have to tell you I don't know yet. So it's really a lot of work to do. And I just wanted to share a short memory which came to my mind. I was working before in Hamburg, and in 2012 I thought I should do an exhibition on women designers, and I had a female boss at that time, and she said, oh no, come on, let's not talk about women in design. And I think this is also very important to notice that especially the younger generation is now starting this research, and I would say women of the older generation, interesting enough, they didn't want to talk about this. So I'm really grateful also again for bringing this topic, Alyona, to our plate within the context of Retrotopia. And now I would like to invite our last speaker, Alla Vronskaya. So thank you for coming to Berlin. You're a professor of history and theory of architecture currently at the University of Kassel. And she was teaching a lot around the globe, ranging from the MIT and the Getty Research Institute and also the Illinois Institute of Technology. And you have also been to the ETH in Switzerland, in Zurich. And you also published widely on the topic of architecture of life, Soviet modernism and the human sciences. And now we are looking very much forward to your presentation. And I just want to, so, Alyona, can you help me? Sorry, I'm not.
Was okay.
This? Oh, sorry. Ah, okay, sorry, it's different here. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for this introduction, and of course, huge thanks to you and Alyona and Agata for organizing this amazing event and the exhibition and inviting me to speak here today, which is really an honor. And what I will be presenting is a group project which is a work of several people, myself included. How is one to rate the history of state socialist women architects who were omnipresent yet often invisible? The traditional archive, as we just heard, whose structure and collections reflect gender power hierarchies, is often silent about the work of women architects. What can a researcher do to compensate for this silence? Should one focus on the work of the few successful outliers, or examine the subfields of the discipline in which women were more present, like interior design and landscape architecture, or reattribute authorship, adding female names, or examine glass ceilings, leaking pipelines, and other social infrastructural barriers that prevented women from acquiring professional prominence? All of these important strategies are used by contemporary scholars, ourselves included. Today, however, I would like to focus on another one. drawing upon post-colonial theory, anthropology, and other fields of knowledge that study marginalized groups, one could search for a different kind of archive, the one in which women's work would be central. And if such archive is not to be found, it should be created. Over the past 2 years, I led the project Second World, Second Sex, Women Architects Under State Socialism, which was sponsored by the Hesse Ministry of Science and Art. This project aimed to create a new, online and openly accessible archive devoted to women in the architecture of state socialist countries, including not only the countries of the Warsaw Pact, but also other countries with similar social and economic system. Within the framework of this project, we created the website womenbuildingsocialism.org, which became a platform for collecting individual biographic profiles, interviews, images, and publications. In addition to traditional information related to women architects' work, we also started to collect information and material that defies the received notion of architecture. We pay attention to a variety of peripheral subfields of architecture, hobbies, and other unusual or supporting activities. Moreover, we have been interested in women architects' activism and amateur creativity, which offer glimpses into their professional everyday and identity. Finally, we record women architects' representations in films, novels, and art, which not only depict, often critically, their everyday life, but also reveal a gender perspective on debates in architectural theory and practice. Before showing you some of our finds, I would like to give a brief introduction to the predicament and identity of women architects under socialism, drawing most of my examples from the Soviet Union. And this will repeat to a certain extent what has already been mentioned. Women in state socialist countries had enjoyed constitutional equality with men at the time when it was unattainable to many women in the West. The politics of the so-called state feminism targeted religious and traditional social structures, endowing women not only with the right, but also with the obligation to study and work. However, despite high employment rates, women remained absent from leadership and government positions. This gender division of power was reflected in architecture. Here, for example, you can see the organizational structure of Lenprojekt Institute, the main design office in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, from 1974. The director is at the top, followed by his 2 deputies and the head engineer. They supervise the work of several administrative departments and 20 design workshops, united into 3 design departments as well as several technical units. To the best of my knowledge, only 1 out of 20 design workshops, namely the workshop number 15, which focused on construction in the suburbs of Leningrad, was led by a woman, Natalia Zakharina, who headed it between 1969 and 1982. Similarly, women were dramatically underrepresented in major design awards. For example, only 12 or slightly above 7% out of 168 recipients of the State Prize of the USSR in Architecture between 1967 and 1991 were female. At the roots of professional inequality was the domestic division of labor, which state socialist systems not only preserved but further solidified. In this still from Soviet Uzbek film The Diamond Necklace, a young daughter of an architecture couple is cooking for her abandoned quote-unquote father, demonstrating the harm of her mother's professional ambition. Women should not be trusted with responsibility at work, one could conclude, because they have to devote their time to taking care of family, their husbands included. To many women, this double burden of professional work and domestic labor indeed appeared worse than patriarchy. Furthermore, the domestic division of labor was mirrored in the professional sphere. Women were delegated tasks associated with care or were asked to assist and support men. Many found employment in the design of schools and daycare centers, in landscape architecture, interior and industrial design, historic preservation, and other areas associated with care or considered less creative. In their seminal volume, Ideological Equals, Mary Pepchinski and Marion Seaman aptly classified the position of women architects under state socialism as ideological equality, which was far removed from the actual one. To put it differently, the gap between the ladder of law and social practice remained too wide to be passable for most women. Reflecting upon this predicament in her satirical little song about the position of women at work, Moscow architect Rima Aldonina sang as early as 1965, and I hope this works. While women often sacrificed their career for maternity, the opposite sacrifice, that of potential maternity to career, which was and still is commonly performed by North Atlantic professionals, was discouraged by the State Socialist Society. And this was, in fact, one of the few issues in which the governments and the dissidents found themselves in accord. Indeed, different dissident groups of various forms and shades, which flourished across the socialist world during the 1970s, saw the problem not in the surviving patriarchy, but in the state-sponsored emancipation. Defining themselves in opposition to state ideology, most of these groups, including women's activist ones, were nationalist and religious. For instance, in Soviet Russia, the first women activists that emerged in the gray zone between the legal and the underground rejected the Western concept of feminism, preferring to call themselves women's movement. deeply religious, many of them were adherents of Orthodox Christian Church, which remained the only legal institution offering an ideological alternative to dogmatic Marxism-Leninism. The main samizdat, or self-published women's journal, which came out in 1980 and 1981, was characteristically called Maria. Similarly, iconic Soviet-Russian film The Love of Mankind foregrounds a young architect's couple who moved to the north of Siberia, presumably to the Arctic city of Norilsk, where the film was shot, to build both a new architecture and a new society. The couple is based on architects Alexander Shipkov, who was the chief architect of Norilsk between 1965 and 67, and his wife, Yelizaveta Shipkova. In the film, the husband, Dmitry, is portrayed as a genius obsessively dedicated to his job, which he sees as a higher calling, the transformation of people's life and social conditions, proposing ambitious projects that are often detached from people's real concerns. Unlike him, his wife, Maria, not again the same name, is depicted as lacking a particular design talent. Instead, her calling, the female version of the love of mankind, is to support Dmitry in his work, including mitigating his creative ego and reminding him of the actual urgent needs of the city's residents. But Maria's prime goal remains bringing him a child. When Maria confers to Dmitry her desire to become a mother, he responds, "But how are we to work?" "Not everyone is to build houses," Maria retorts. "Giving birth is our women's foremost work." In the absence of feminism, the domestic sphere, including not only a gendered division of labor, but also gendered activities such as hobbies and crafts, became a key part of socialist women architects' self-perception, while also providing them with a way and a language of expressing political dissent. A dissatisfaction not only with state feminism, but also with state modernism. For instance, for the Armenian architect Perchanush Msran Oksuzan, who headed the Department of Urban Planning and Development of the State Construction Committee of the Armenian Socialist Republic between 1960 and 1970, crocheting, embroidery, and other crafts were more than a hobby. When her husband was killed in the Second World War, she had to turn to sewing to support the family. She continued making crafts for the rest of her life, giving them to children and grandchildren, and these are the images that we received from her granddaughter, Helena Huber-Doudová, who curated an online exhibition about her grandmother on our website. More than a lady's hobby, in the context of her professional work, these crafts could be interpreted as an expression of personal resistance to the aesthetics of industrial construction. Amateur and volunteer activity of women architects could further expand the notion of architecture. The already mentioned Rima Aldonina, whom we saw singing, was the lead singer, lyrics author, and, with construction engineer Alexander Heifetz, the performance director of Ryszynka, literally small T-square from German Reichsschiene, a satirical musical ensemble of women architects, which was founded in 1953 at Muszyńska Institute. Ryszynka was the counterpart of the male Koh-i-Noor, named after the popular Czech pencil brand. The two ensembles existed for over 5 decades, often performing together and giving numerous concerts, over 1,500 altogether. Despite their popularity, the ensembles were considered amateur and never received remuneration. This, however, enabled a greater degree of freedom, and the lyrics were often highly critical of Soviet architecture, construction industry, and society. As the last example of what a cultural and anthropological perspective could offer to architectural history, I would like to consider the gendered criticism of modernist urban environment. Whereas in the United States, Jane Jacobs famously opposed Robert Moses' reconstruction of New York City and was characteristically dismissed by him as a mother, despite also being a professional architecture journalist, similar battles played out in socialist cities shortly after. And since men remained in control of the architectural profession, their female colleagues leveled on them a double critique of both the gender usurpation of power and of creative failure. For many of them, the alleged male rationalism, which had been touted during Khrushchev's standardization years, was precisely where the problem laid. Without care, love, and emotional engagement, the city dies. In 1973, Alyona and Muszyńska sang.
Что
applause for Aldona. She's amazing and still around. I'm almost finished. I'd like to show you one last example from East Germany, where a similar accusation was leveled in Brigitte Reimann's novel Franziska Linkerhand, turned into a film, Unser kurzes Leben, Our Short Life, in 1981. Franziska, a young and idealistic female architect, opts for moving to work on the construction of a new and remote industrial town, which portrayed Hoyerswerda, where Reimann moved to observe the lives of the workers. Franziska is appalled by the myopic approach of the Institute's director, who is concerned solely with the budget and construction norms. Her humanist, emotionally rich approach is juxtaposed to his soulless mechanicism. And the quote on the left is actually from Lewis Mumford, the American urban theorist, which she ironically signs with the name of Karl Marx. The perceived failure of socialist state modernism and of socialist state feminism was among the reasons of the socialist bloc's collapse and has led to the rise of both conservative aesthetics and conservative social politics in post-socialist countries. Uncovering and analyzing the entangled histories of modernism, feminism, and the lives, struggles, and resistance of socialist women architects is thus important today, not only to shed light on their hidden legacy, but also to understand the making and unmaking of the socialist modernist project at large, its principles and underpinnings, its affects and effects. And in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that our website is there to provide the infrastructure for collecting and sharing information. It is a project that's endless on purpose and relies on contributions of other authors, and we're always happy to find those who are interested in participating and sharing material. Thank you very much for your attention, and please don't hesitate to contact us if you'd like to collaborate.
I'm just going to ask one or two questions, and please, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and my job is to moderate this. For the designers, primarily, but really anyone else jump in, I was really fascinated by the objects that were presented, and also not just by women, but designed by women for women. There was always this theme of the body that was in a lot, or the atypical body. And I was wondering, in Western societies under capitalism, consumption is associated with the feminine. And this is from this trope of the 19th and 20th century. What happens in stage socialism? You have your planned economies. On one hand, on the other hand, some of these beautiful presentations where consumer objects are being presented in these beautiful, beautiful settings, and they're beautiful objects in themselves. I mean, people should consume them. So what happens there between this notion of beautifully designed objects that are innovative for all sorts of reasons, the female as designer, but also then the female as consumer? I mean, what kind of consumer society did you have in a society that's not based on consumption?
Well, one of the parts that I intentionally skipped from my presentation was about this turn in economics that actually allowed women designers to step in representing different gender perspectives to the market. And it was connected with these processes of glut and economic overstocking during the Brezhnev era in the 70s. So it was the first time when, for example, designers from the VT started intentionally collaborate with sociologists, started asking questions why the youth do not want to buy grandfather's watches anymore, and what can we propose to them instead. And this was the first time that there were some promises of doing something specially for women. For instance, I was researching the watches and cloak topic for a long time in depth, and it was interesting, for example, that in the late 80s they promised to develop a model of underwater cloaks, watches for divers, for women, because there are women divers, surprisingly, but this promise never happens after the perestroika, so it's like they managed to go up till the 80s, so with these stereotypes of women needing only small decorative watches, and the women who during the late 70s tried to carry on male watches instead were criticized for doing something unproportional to their small feminine hands. So it was this type of things, but also similar to the international trends. What I read in sociologists who were published through the Technical Aesthetics journal and some other media publications like Grids, he wrote that women should be the leaders of consumption because of the cultural background, because of the everyday practices, being responsible for family household. So they were kind of referring to the women consumers a lot too.
Yeah, so great question. So in Poland, during Stalinism, women were openly criticized for their tendency, their liking of consumerist goods, and there is even a painting, a very popular one, in this social realism style by painter Wojciech Fangor, and on the painting you can see a couple of workers, a man and a woman, and who look like very, I don't know, they are idealized. Their faces are. I mean, they're still they're represented as in this social realism style and everything, but the expression of their faces is like they have so much dignity and everything. And next to them there is a woman, very fashionable one, dressed in this Western. 60s, the 50s style, wearing sunglasses. On her dress there is, you can even see some inscriptions saying Coca-Cola and stuff like this. And the message is that she's the enemy of the working people, and that she's basically representing the corrupted West. But then after Stalinism, there's
but the woman is then bad taste. It's not like a guy.
It's not like a guy. It's the woman. It's the woman. Yes, it's also very important. Thank you for emphasizing this. And then after Stalinism, there is more tolerance in society. It's even called I'm not sure if I would agree, but it's some people call it first backlash, sort of, and this is a time after Stalinism where women are allowed to consume luxurious, not luxurious, but goods that were seen as something completely forbidden and bad during Stalinism. And also they're not needed in this areas where they were needed before, as a physical workers in the factories, in factories, yes, but maybe in construction site, etc. And yes, and that's what happened after. That's what happens after Stalinism, and so there is this the society becomes more, and the authorities as well become more tolerant of women consuming goods. And then in the 70s there is this, especially first half of the 70s, there is this time when it's called, the same thing I think happened maybe a bit earlier or later in Czechoslovakia, that the authorities are more not imposing, like of course imposing as well, but more like negotiating with the society, and okay, you can have like this moderate consumption, and we can like, you know, keep our power, and so yeah.
Oh, that's a way to keep our power.
Yes.
We like to buy something.
Yes, yes.
Recently, I would add that it was actually Khrushchev with his kitchen debate who was actually saying, okay, our kitchen is better than your kitchen. That like paved the way for this accepting of consumption. So I think like both in both East and West, like the society was more or less heading towards like some kind of consumer system, whereas in socialism they were saying ideologically, we are better because we don't have this excess of consumption, and we are not necessarily, we don't have to be original, you know, like and individualistic. We are doing like everything, like our design is for everybody or for all, and we are more cost efficient because we better planned, and we actually want to secure everybody with work, housing, and so forth. So that we are like ideologically superior. And so I don't think there was like this iron curtain in this case. There was like this iron curtain, and like they were like really reflecting. Like I think both of the societies the same path. Only like in socialism, like in the 80s, you didn't have this variety of assortment, meaning that people were not they were simply like not satisfied. And this like unsatisfaction, I think more or less with this consumer's desires, like unfulfilled, with like the majority of society actually went, was a part of this breakthrough of the whole system, more or less.
If I may step in with a comment considering kitchen debates, there was one very interesting issue considering the translation and the gender of words used, because when it was translated to Khrushchev and Nixon were talking about the dishwashing machine that is available to American women, there is the same profession attributed to women as посудомойка, so naturally profession for women who wash dishes. And Khrushchev replied that you first turned your women to dishwashers, and then you gave them dishwashers in order to compensate that. And it was kind of his aggressive excuse for not having such devices available to Soviet women. And at the same time, many people agree that this kitchen debate, of course, were one of the step points into establishing the All-Union Institute for Technical Aesthetics in 1984, in order to in 1962. In order to show that we also have our own design practice and theory, but many of designers from the milieu, they were saying that, okay, we were only trying to imitate the West in many cases, and there was even this word "цельно тянутое," the completely stolen one, that meant that we were just in the beginning, many projects were just copied from the West the way they were found or brought to the USSR, and later on they tried to develop many unique ideas, but as I said, two-thirds of them went into the table and never went to the production because there were no economical stimulus for production. And many of designers like Mite and Kant, who moved to the United States, and some others like Paris Berlin, they complained that there is no design without a market. The design was invented by the market, so everything that Soviets proposed was a theory, and if we can consider a pure theory a design, that was one of the questions that I tried to raise in my part of the exhibition, because I only showed imaginary projects there.
I think the kitchen debate, and like you just said, illustrates very important differences between socialist consumerism and Western consumerism, and socialist economy worked in such a way that consumption was never a factor of economic planning. So design was not developed in order to facilitate consumption, but it had a different purpose. It had an educational purpose. The kitchen debate also illustrates the difference between the American approach to design objects, but also to design itself as a field, and the Soviet approach that was not looking after improving stimulating consumption in order to keep the economy running, but it was rather targeting collective distribution of domestic tasks. So it was a different model of domestic work that the kitchen exemplified, and the design was also part of. So, in other words, what I guess I'm trying to say is that consumption was a factor, but the purpose of consumption was different.
Yeah, and overconsumption was always criticized. Like there are some movies from the 80s where a person who collects tape recorders at his apartment is considered also like as an anti-socialist character. Within the movie, he's interviewed like a person who has some kind of deviations.
It was about satisfying the need rather than stimulating somebody to buy something. So the act of buying was not there, right? And when it came to satisfying the need, then was the question of how do you satisfy that need and what else do you do in the process? So then the idea was that you also improve the taste and the personality and the environment of the human.
And it's very much connected with the way advertisement functioned. Because in many cases, like one example is Fly with the Aeroflot company. There were no other companies, so there was no choice, but they still had lots of place for advertisement. And the other example was that with a New Goods magazine that was based on a special pavilion at the Wedding Hall, where all the best the products designed in the USSR were showcased. And this magazine was published since 1957 till the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in many issues, in the Q&A sections, they say like, dear readers, please stop asking us where you can buy those items. We only here for your information to say that these items were designed or produced. We have no idea where you can get them. Advertisement working only like as informational source of propaganda that yes, we do have such things. Like there was a joke about a little kid in a kindergarten who all children are asking, in which country all the children have the best toys in the world? In the USSR, in which country children had the best, food? In the USSR. Why do you cry, little kid? I want to live in the USSR.
Well, anyway, so I think that just opens. Thank you for this, these comments, because it just opens up these questions about what is consumption objects and design. What does that mean to our daily lives? And I think it's also interesting to reflect on how that's seen in other contexts as well. I have a question for the architects, and everybody else jump in. What comes out when we look at socialism is that it's not really about this, the one genius designer, although there was sort of that in this Russian film, right? The husband's the designer and whatever. But basically, it's this collective act. I mean, that's really that's the emphasis that we're all doing. It's this collective, and there's maybe one person at the head, but it's really a collective. And then when we research the biographies of women, we often find maybe they're not the head, but there's this mass of people here, and they make a lot of that mass of people, and they're very influential, or they play an important role in a project or whatever. So the question is, and then that becomes reflected in the archives and how we collect it, and et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, the same situation is with the Ballers, these architects here in West Berlin who did these very sculptural, expressive buildings. There was an exhibition last year, the Deutsches Architekturzentrum here. They split up, they worked together for 30 years, built all these amazing buildings. They split up around 1990, and he basically takes the archive, and it's the same thing. I saw a talk with her where basically she says, he's got the drawings. So again, what happens in one context often happens in the other. But going back to my bigger question is, do we really have to think not about filling in the holes of the archive? There's 600 men and we've found 600 women. Or do we have to really rethink the question of authorship, especially when it comes to architecture?
I think we do have to do this, and this is what I was also trying to argue for in the presentation. The harder question is, how do you do that within the structural constraints of an archive or a museum? Yeah, when you have the collection structured by name, do you redo it? And I know I'm not a part of the museum world, but I do get to hear people talking about that. Yeah, then they introduce new search systems when you create a computer system that allows you to search through all the collections by some other systems, key terms and so on. And but it's a very difficult question because it's structured already. Yeah, it also is a part of history.
Yeah, I think. One would really has to start to explain that it was like a collective endeavor, because now, as we are kind of looking back at the socialist past, there is this tendency to re-establish actually the agency of the author, so that the socialist history of architecture is again like the history of like the names, and even like with architecture historians, it's like that, and I think it was like, that there was like this situation of no authorship, like the people were not credited as the authors. Then 30 years, it was like this mega egomaniac focus on authorship with the architects themselves, because they had the feeling they reconstitute their subjectivity after their authorship being suppressed and everything. But now it's also about the historians, because I mean it's not that that people, like women are often present, but then they're like written out of the history, because if you focus on these like standard definition of architecture as like built substance, big names and big buildings, it will happen again that these women will be written out of history. Yeah.
I can add on that because I worked with a journal of USSR architecture. What I've already noticed is that because of this collective nature of working on projects, it is relevant for Soviet design, but even more relevant for Soviet architecture. It was a huge collectives, and although most of them are correctly, at least to my knowledge, mentioned in a magazine, it's like one man on top and a huge amount of women doing technical work, and the same parallels I found when I was analyzing work positions of women in the Institute of Furniture in Moscow. So one way is to start considering these huge collectives and start considering the importance of contribution on a technical level, because very often women were limited to these more boring or sometimes more responsible technical tasks that were not reflected in the final representation, and a similar similarities with what I presented considering women in ergonomic departments, so physics, psychologists or chemics. If we think about works being produced by huge institutions, that you should consider all departments of these institutions that were involved, and they are not reflected in a final patent on a particular product or credit for an architecture project.
Also pay attention to the different types of assignments, as I was mentioning, like parks, public spaces, and interior, also architecture as interior, like as like a part of it, like an intact, like one creative moment, because otherwise. But I mean, it's true. Like women started studying architecture in bigger numbers in the 50s, so it's quite obvious that they can't be present everywhere. But you have to try to trace it to also these non-standard categories of architecture in order to capture their creativity.
The notion of authorship is very closely intertwined with the idea of intellectual property, copyright. And maybe one other way of approaching it would be to fight for fair use and common forms of ownership of intellectual property.
And that also tells us looking at objects differently, not from the hand of me niece or whomever, but it's produced in some other way. Just a funny story, I showed the House of the People in Bucharest, and Anca Petrescu is sort of identified as the architect, and why? I mean, she was the go-between person between the Ceausescus and the hundreds of architects who produced the engineers, whatever, produced the building. And it was only, and everybody knew she was sort of the public face. She would get, you know, photographed with it. Everybody knew she was like sort of this head figure. She'd been the motor behind realizing Ceausescu's kind of designs. And it was only after 1990, right? And all these people start coming to Bucharest, and they say, "Well, look at this big thing. Who designed it?" And it was like, well, nobody designed it. You know, Ceausescu did this, and this one did that, and here and there, and somehow it happened. No one would even think of saying that so-and-so was the architect. And that's when then she goes and officially names herself as architect of the building, so she can claim it as her intellectual property, and she made all the decisions that they were changing that. But the impetus comes from the West, because they could not believe the fact that such a big building didn't have like one person, you know, behind it as the author. So I think those are things that we kind of, these questions into socialism and socialist production make us look at bigger questions of architecture that aren't limited to this case. Can I open it up now to any comments from our guests? Or Claudia, you have a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah, now I have a new question. I very much like the idea of redefining authorship, but nevertheless we have the history and history writing of the past. So what do we do with the history and with all these big names which are established in, let's say, the history of architecture or the history of design, the history of art? And I mean, it's, yeah, I very much like the idea, but when it comes to the past, I really think that it's super important what in fact you are doing, trying to look for archives, trying to make things visible, to publish things. And I mean, this is also a little bit was one of the aims of Retrotopia. We had also an archive which unfortunately is not any longer on show, which has to do with some heavy rainfalls, and we had an emergency and we had to take out all the objects. But research and really making things visible, and I surely believe in the fact that we have to rewrite history in many cases, not only the history of architecture, but in many disciplines, I would say. And yeah, but maybe from now on we could think of and introduce new how you say that, formulations or of authorship. But with regard to the past, I think it's still very important, as said, what you are doing. And also one more comment to how should, as museums people, because I'm a museum person, and I think, yeah, it's difficult. On one hand, I think let's not try to fill the holes of the past. I'm much more for, but I'm speaking as someone curating design, and I would say, okay, let's more, so there are other collections who have, when it comes for GDR design, for instance, we don't have anything, but our colleagues have that. So I would not try to fill all those holes, because you can't do that, but I would try from now on to collect with a broader and much more open mind. So, yeah.
So we have some questions. 1, 2, 3. Let's start there.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment, actually, following on from Claudia, but thinking about architecture rather than collections of design, it would be, okay, we talk about sometimes seriality, but often one-off buildings, so the architecture itself is often there as the object, so we're not trying to, what we're trying to do is fill holes in the archive, the information about it. I find it quite provocative when Helena said, we can't just show Xerox copy. So you thought, well, why not? Because if you can start adding some of the marginal research that you've been doing, but also you've got some of those people there, you've also got the spaces, you've got the parks, the kindergartens, you've got someone to maybe walk through the spaces and talk about how they designed them, why they like this, and you've got the Xerox copy. I think sometimes it's about putting lots of different information together and being very effective. And the reason I think it's interesting is because not an architect or historian, certainly not a design historian, but I mean this is still happening, isn't it? And we all debates in current architecture and which women are being made head of which architectural associations, and then walking out after 2 years because they feel completely constrained, and it's going on and on and on. So I think somehow by exposing that in the past, you can also have some kind of political agency now and in the future going forwards, that this, what's actually changed. I think that's a big, for me, the elephant in the room is it's very interesting, this particular period of socialist countries in the period, and also comparing that to maybe other, but actually what about now? For young women entering professional, or women in the middle at senior levels who have never perhaps achieved what they'd like to achieve. And how do they, like your talk, the couples, I don't remember the name, where she's already lost her archive.
These are very Berlin architects. Henrik and Inge Bauer, you might have seen these very sculptural buildings that were built in the 70s and the 80s. And they were very well known and everything right now. But they split up and both remained active professionally, but their famous work. There was an exhibition last year, catalogs in German and English, really their reception of
There's something about working in the present to reflect in the past, like interviewing young women architects now and seeing what the challenges they're facing and trying to trace some of those common threads might be quite interesting.
Yes, I'm sorry, just to respond. But when you're doing a publication now on there's like important architect and a younger architect working on a commission, it received a prize, and all we have is from her. She doesn't have the plans. We only have like some kind of newspaper article or whatever, and that copy is really bad, So either it's and for publication, then you don't have like a good publication, or I understand, but then you have like a bad publication in the end, if you don't have this like kind of like properly scanned, digitized material, then it's just I think I understand it as a provocation. It's really.
I think it's about changing the way we value certain aesthetics as well. In order, so I think something like architecture, very expensive books, very high quality, super. It's part of the whole value system, isn't it? Whereby these superstar architects achieve their position, isn't it? By having these kind of publications.
Mine's Stephen here with my experience. Sometimes we just were redrawing them if the author is still alive, or making reconstructions like that for the project. It's one of the solutions, and as a back commentary to Claudia, I'm sure it's not like the best solution of how can we treat design history, but one of the definitely possible alternative ways. I very much like what Julia Karpova did in her book Commonalities Objects. Like instead of, it was her answer of how can you alternate this superstar design history is writing a history of objects, giving agency to everyday objects whose authors we probably do not even know. If we found one, then it's great. If not, then we can still focus more on everyday activities and objects that shape our life, like these chairs we're sitting on, and that would help us to rediscover many ignored actors within this field.
But this does not help the main problem which is behind all our discussions, the role and of women in our society. Sorry.
Yeah, but if you start having this perspective,
it does not help to change it, and I think this is also super important.
Sava, would you like to comment?
I think it's a really exciting. Thanks for fantastic presentations, but also this question of how does working with women help us ask more fundamental questions about our value systems? And I just wanted to follow up on that, because the question of individual and collective authorship is really interesting. What I also hear in these presentations is an expansion of the idea of what kind of archival object needs in an architectural context, because this is so much also about cultural and political context, and we've heard about interviews, we've seen movies that are maybe not necessarily thought of as archival objects for architecture. So I was just wondering, some of you here are working on more public scholarships, doing archives with a greater public and for a greater public, very accessible. So how are you thinking about what belongs into an architectural archive? Should we stop thinking about only people who are professional architects and include other people who engage with architecture? Or could we have other kinds of documents to store something from the architectural past?
I could maybe start responding to a question by also returning to Helena's remark. I was thinking about the other example with the Xerox copy. Your archive is a part of the Gallery of Art, right?
Of the National Gallery.
Of the National Gallery, but it's connected to the National of Art. So, now returning to your question, does it matter where that archive sits, whether it's archive that is a part of the National Gallery, or if it's that archive is affiliated with another institution, in which case it might get liberated, so to say, from some assumptions about what constitutes art as a precious object. Yeah, this idea of object with an aura is no longer a part of what is expected, and then we would think, where would that archive belong? And I can't say I have a solid answer to that question. We've been trying to do an online, open database that is all inclusive and everything can go in, and it's also a difficult approach. And I'm dealing with the challenge, but yeah, we'll see.
I think you mentioned with online databases, the rights and there's an authorship.
It's such a nightmare, yeah.
It's a kind of question and feedback to your lectures. It was interesting for me. My question was how these great women deal with this inequality. Did they try to demand for more equality, or they try to adjust to this situation and live in it? And for me, it was very interesting to learn about this exhibition in Czech Republic. The women in the 80s get together and show themselves, and learn that there was a critique from women in these videos in Moscow Architectural Institute. And I'm a practicing architect in Berlin, and we established a festival for women in architecture, which was in 2021, and it's kind of empowering for me to learn about this experience in the past. And thank you for these insights.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting connection between just women in practice and feminism, as a not just right, because when we talk in the ivory tower, our ideas, are perfect, right? They're ideas, but then this connection to practice. And it's interesting to look back to socialism, that period, because technically they were separated from the second women's movement, all the literature and activities that were happening. But obviously, with the situation in Moravia, something was happening. There was some kind of communication or whatever that got to the point where women actually made this exhibition. And just from, no one's really looked at these connections, and I'm sure there's a lot there. And there's been some research about in the East German architects that, again, emancipation was controlled by the state. The state produced had their own programs to advance women in management positions and documentation about women in the building industry. But colleagues who do this research have told me that when you look at the applications to get into the Bund Deutsche Architekten, which was everybody's working in an office, and this is sort of the next step. You've worked for a number of years and you have a certain position, so you apply, and it's like a little honorary thing that you add at the end of your name. When you look at these applications, very, very often you had to have two supporters who support the application, who are already in it. Very often it's women supporting other women. So, which is kind of like a little bit of emancipation from the ground up. just in these very simple ways. And so I think there's a lot more there that, this sort of like these movements without the theory, just with the practice, and then probably bigger connections that are being made, and that we have to do more work on.
I really have that feeling that in trying to rediscover who these people even were by looking through magazines to find names, that the next wave will be exactly these networks and connections and all of that sort of richness behind, which I think maybe came out a little bit today in some of the talks, but I have a feeling that there's an enormous amount still to even do to tell us about.
And it's also maybe important to recognize that it was exceptional for women under state socialism to identify as a feminist, but nevertheless, women had other forms of gender identification and resistance and self-support. So this example of Mary with women supporting each other's application can be one as trying to sort of play with this idea that could we actually treat domestic crafts as a way of saying something about architecture? Yeah, so maybe we have to look. Yeah, there's examples with singing and exhibitions. They're more familiar, so we immediately identify them as a protest gesture. But maybe we could just keep looking for other forms of voicing their resistance or their opinion.
Yeah, on the other hand, I often encounter that, like those women architects who kind of like became really successful, they don't want to be classified as like women architects because like when they once managed, even though it was like 2 or 3 of them, once they managed to get to the top, they like feel like they are like on the same level as their male counterparts. So it's not that, but it's not very often, and it's probably like just very few names, and the other ones are actually quite surprised that we are interested in their work, which is like a nice experience, and like quite open and to speak like about like what they did and how they were doing everything. So. So one encounters like this resistance towards this sort of feminist or gender definition of the profession. But some women, I mean, often they say, well, I was never ever thinking about the leading position or something like that. So, I mean, it is also like a way of education, that they were not really like motivated to go further, and maybe assume some kind of like, I mean, it's the same prejudice as nowadays, that you don't have, you usually be that ambitious, and that, so I think there is a lot of like factors, like when like speaking about this like second wave of like, I mean, there's like this like top-down emancipation, right, with the, like legal norms in socialist lands, like in 1950s, with this equality in the family and this like working conditions and everything. So like these women, they didn't feel the need to articulate anything because they had like their independence, also economic independence since after the war, So it was like a little bit of a different situation. But then they were like unprepared, for like for like after 1990, they didn't have the arguments or anything. So I think that was like the critical phase of when these roles also like shifted and women also lost a little bit of like ground.
And I had a very similar experience to Helena. Many women were very surprised that I wanted to interview them in the first place. And also first they repeated some standard phrases or ideas that they were taught to believe in, like Svetlana Ulsova. First in a video she tells me that Soviet women could achieve anything like equally to a man if they worked equally to a man. And then through her life story and professional biography we see that she wasn't allowed to become an architect because her mother advised her for a more practical profession, so she had to start with engineering, then relearning to design. Then she had to quit one department at the BIT because she designed a couple of innovative solutions for tape recorders, and her male head of the department were on top of every patent. And then so she went to another department. She was given a task alone for the household goods. It was more easily to get a task as an individual designer. So she was designing a piece where you can store some bread, and it was supposed to keep the bread soft for a longer period of time. She designed it all herself, and then it comes to the industrial patent, and someone says like, okay, let's put these guys on top. She said, no way, I did it alone. This time I can prove that. And they said, okay, but then it will never go to the mass production. And she said, I don't mind, I just need my patent with my name only. And she has this, and this product never went to the mass production. And then when she became the head of the group of other 3 female designers, she always allowed them to make individual projects. Like they did a group project with all of them mentioned, and then she said, okay, we have a little bit of budget, we have some time, then each one of you can make your own individual proposal, because she recognizes authorship. And this was just one example of the woman who said like, no, we have all the rights equal.
It's maybe this difference is exemplified by what Mary put at the title of the exhibition, Frau Architekt, the distinction between architect and Architektin, between East and West Germany. Yeah, and in the East, it was also in the Harald Engler's article from the book, where he says how strongly women architects in East Germany identified with this term architect and resisted to be called Architektin, and also denied that, as also Alyona said, that they experienced any discrimination in the professional sphere. And it's interesting. One could say, they were brainwashed and so on, but it's also about belief in this natural or naturalization of that domestic division of labor.
But it can also be how much you're being influenced by all these voices around you, because it's very interesting about when East German women architects and when West German women architects had some contact with one another in the late 80s. The East Germans basically were saying, we want to be considered, an architect, we're men, we're as good as the men. We don't want to be women because that's something weak, and we've proven ourselves in our offices, we've done all this stuff, and we want the men to say, yep, you're one of us. So they would get up when they'd be allowed to go to some event in the West, they would get up there and present it and say, we're just like the men. Meanwhile, the West German women have gone through second wave feminism. Another thing to be researched is the feminist movement in architecture in West Germany, and especially West Berlin. It's really, really fascinating, the discourses that emerged for many, many different reasons, and some of the projects that occurred, and publications as well. But anyway, the West German women architects, they're in a worse situation, because they don't have daycare, it's harder to get a job, the whole deal. And they've become mobilized. They're very, very critical about the forces in the profession. They say, we don't want to make men's architecture because they've made the whole world a mess. If women do it, we're going to do it better. So we want to do women's architecture, or their architecture. This is about men, and we want one that's more inclusive. That's women's. So they would get up to these companies and say, we're making like our feminist architecture, our women's thing, and the East German women say, no, we want to be just like men. And this is the point where they're not talking to one another. But you can also say these are the worlds that they're inhabiting. It's so I think there's a lot more to be done here. So you younger guys, right?
It's about the second wave feminism, the first wave feminism,
and how, but also what they're receiving and what they're internalizing.
When you talk about the way people were influenced by their surrounding, shouldn't we start from the primary school or even kindergarten? So look at the whole education chain.
Yeah.
Because when I was preparing for this workshop at the Graz University on the DIY culture, I had this insight based on my own personal experience, because none of the women ever mentioned, who I interviewed before, never mentioned their DIY experience. they found that it has nothing to do with their professional activity. And I recall, because when I was going to the primary school in the early 90s, it was still pretty much Soviet in the spirit, and I was the only girl in the class who fleeced from the sewing classes to the metalworks and woodworks department in the basement, and the director of the school on the meeting and my class teacher, they were humiliating me, asking like publicly, maybe you're a boy, why do you try to avoid sewing? And I said like, no, I'm a girl who likes woodworking. And from that experience, I've called back to some women I was in touch with and asked them about their practices, and found out that they found a way to sneak into getting their hands on metal and wood at an early age, non-officially. This is just one example. And I'm curious about the differences in school education in West and East Germany from this perspective.
I think we're slowly coming to the end. How much more time do we have?
Yeah, so 5 minutes.
I worked in Dresden. So I started in '92, so right after the wall came down, and so I really experienced, but 2, almost 3 people, and then the people I'm meeting, who I'm working with, and then the young people who went through the system, and as time went on, that the system was less present. But the systems really shaped people. And my Eastern, from Eastern, Neues Bundesland, the new federal state students would say, well, it's normal, that when you have your kid and the kid's like a couple months old, you just bring it to the daycare and you go back to work. This is the most normal thing in the world. And guess what? Grandmother brought the kids to the daycare center, Mama brought the kids to the daycare center. When I'm finished my degree, I'm going to bring my kids to the daycare. This was normal. And if you went to a Western university in the 90s, whatever, it was like, oh my God, you're having a child. Well, you've got to stay home, and your child needs you. And it was this whole other, really mentality, like, this is normal. I bring my child to the daycare center. This is normal. I'm going to, I have to stay home and I take care of the child, and oh my God, So it was really, and I can go on and on and on with other examples, but it was very interesting to see how really people were shaped by the system that they were in. So
I was wondering, there also be differences in terms of class or as a social background, educational, parents' education, to which extent women in the different parts of Europe have been able to enter architectural education. I can speak from the egalitarian Scandinavian welfare states. If you look at what women were educated as architects, almost all of them, as up to the 1980s, almost all of them had parents with a much, much higher education rate than other parts of the population. This would also go for the men. But I was wondering, could this be different in former socialist countries?
There's been a study by Karen Zachman. Her study was on the mobilization of women in East Germany, focusing on documentation of the TU Dresden. And what she found was basically what you're saying, that in the 50s, women were going into the technical, so women are being pushed into the technical subjects. And at the university level, the women who were doing engineering, architecture, chemical engineering, whatever, these engineering fields, because they knew that this is, if we're going to stay in the East, this is where we're going to, make a career or have better opportunities or whatever. They tended to come from a bourgeois background, and basically she argues that they studied technical subjects to maintain their class status. The men, as a rule, come from a lower, they might be middle class, but it's not as high, shopkeepers or skilled work, and this is where you gain status. So you're studying architecture, engineering, so you're going to kind of get a little bit higher up, and or as a woman you're doing it, so you're not going to fall down. So that happens early on. And again, when you start going through, it's an interesting question, but when you start, like if you look at the Bauhaus, like the women who are studying architecture in the Bauhaus, they're overwhelmingly very well situated. And you have a lot of men who are just, handwerker or craftspeople or, not that same level. But it's a good question, and I think we have to,
There was in under state socialism, there was a lot less need for design than in the West, right? Because of the system of industrial production of architecture, which meant that there was a lot fewer schools of architecture than elsewhere in the West. So the proportion of population who would go to study architecture was many, many times smaller in the East than in the West, which led to the fact that it became a highly dynastic field. So it was generations of architects, children, grandchildren, and it was almost impossible to break through. And this is one of the facts that maybe, it's always in the background. Yeah, we're talking about a very elite and very close-up community of when we're talking about female architects.
And at least 1/3 of women designers whose project I showed today told me that they wanted to be architects in the first place, but they had some difficulties from various kinds. Anna Andreeva was from a non-proletarian family, a rich family, and during the 30s she was not allowed to enter the architecture institution. In case of Ursula, she was not allowed by her mother because it's not a profession with which women can make a living. And Tatiana Suslova told me that she was not allowed to enter the architecture university because she has a rare women's form of daltonism, so she has a color blindness. And I said, like, but you were allowed to get a design education with it? She said, yeah, of course, why not? So it were different cases, but it was really very elitist.
But on the other hand, like somebody like under socialism had like a bourgeois background, I mean, quite often the children were not even allowed to study at a university. So yeah, there were like also moments like that. So it's not, and I think there were like programs, bringing like proletarian sort of children to the education. So, but I mean, like over taking, like seeing, like from current sociological numbers, it's still like, I mean, even though the education is for free and everything, you have like this like social support and everything, it's still in check that like children of like high school or university educated parents are most likely, obviously, to actually also get a university degree. So yeah, it's not that
as well. Statistically, as you said, like it was like certain background that definitely gave you an advantage, but the social mobility like was like really started back then. And so
on the other hand, you didn't have the class distinction as for what you owned, because everybody had like the same things. You couldn't distinguish between the doctor's family and the whatever family of somebody who's like working in a flower shop, because like the differences of this income was like not that high. So yeah. So there was not like this sort of class this distinction to income.
So there's these discussions, everything that everyone said, I think we could just take it and keep going in different directions. And so, maybe there are no more comments or contributions. Maybe first of all, we just want to thank all of you here for this amazing event.
Yeah, I want to thank you for coming, for your really incredible, interesting presentations and insights, so we all understand there is still a lot to do. And thanks a lot also, Mary, for this really fantastic Q&A. It's really brought many more interesting points to the table, and I think we could continue, but we already started at 2, so I think now it's time to have a drink or something. Thanks for coming. Thanks for all your contributions, and the exhibition, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, it's only running until Sunday. At Sunday there is a finissage starting at 4 p.m. and we will have around 7 co-curators who will join. Helena will also be there, and Alyona will be there, and 5 more, and then you are heartily invited to the tour, and at 6 p.m. we will have some nice music. The Bolschewistische Kulturkapelle will play and in front of the museum, so in fact you have nothing else to do, so please pass by and join us for the finissage. So thanks everyone and have a nice evening. Thank you.